This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. The Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, translated by Richard Crawley. Book 4, Chapter 12. Next summer, about the time of the corn's coming into ear, 10 Syracusan and as many Locrian vessels sailed to Messina in Sicily, and occupied the town upon the invitation of the inhabitants, and Messina revolted from the Athenians. The Syracusans contrived this chiefly because they saw that the place afforded an approach to Sicily, and feared that the Athenians might hereafter use it as a base for attacking them with a larger force. The Locrians because they wished to carry on hostilities from both sides of the strait, and to reduce their enemies, the people of Rhegium. Meanwhile the Locrians had invaded the Rhegian territory with all their forces, to prevent their succouring Messina, and also at the instance of some exiles from Rhegium who were with them, the long factions by which that town had been torn rendering it for the moment incapable of resistance, and thus furnishing an additional temptation to the invaders. After devastating the country, the Locrian land forces retired, their ships remaining to guard Messina, while others were being manned for the same destination to carry on the war from thence. About the same time in the spring, before the corn was ripe, the Peloponnesians and their allies invaded Attica under Agis, the son of Archidamus, king of the Lacedaemonians, and sat down and laid waste the country. Meanwhile the Athenians sent off the 40 ships which they had been preparing to Sicily, with the remaining generals Eurymedon and Sophocles, their colleague Pythodorus having already proceeded from thither. These had also instructions as they sailed to look to the Corcyrians in the town who were being plundered by the exiles in the mountains. To support these exiles, 60 Peloponnesian vessels had lately sailed, it being thought that the famine raging in the city would make it easy for them to reduce it. Demosthenes also, who had remained without employment since his return from Acarnania, applied and obtained permission to use the fleet, if he wished it, upon the coast of Peloponnese. Off Laconia they heard that the Peloponnesian ships were already at Corcyra, upon which Eurymedon and Sophocles wished to hasten to the island, but Demosthenes required them first to touch at Pylos, and do what was wanted there, before continuing their voyage. While they were making objections, a squall chanced to come on and carried the fleet into Pylos. Demosthenes at once urged them to fortify the place, it being for this that he had come on the voyage, and made them observe that there was plenty of stone and timber on the spot, and that the place was strong by nature, and together with much of the country round unoccupied. Pylos, or Coryphasium, as the Lacedaemonians call it, being about 45 miles distant from Sparta, and situated in the old country of the Messenians. The commanders told him that there was no lack of desert headlands in Peloponnese if he wished to put the city to expense by occupying them. He, however, thought that this place was distinguished from others of the kind by having a harbour close by, while the Messenians, the old natives of the country, speaking the same dialect as the Lacedaemonians, could do them the greatest mischief by their incursions from it, and would at the same time be a trusty garrison. After speaking to the captains of companies on the subject and failing to persuade either the generals or the soldiers, he remained inactive with the rest from stress of weather, until the soldiers themselves wanting occupation were seized with a sudden impulse to go round and fortify the place. Accordingly they set to work in earnest, and having no iron tools, picked up stones and put them together as they happened to fit, and where mortar was needed carried it on their backs, for want of hods, stooping down to make it stay on, and clasping their hands together behind to prevent it falling off, sparing no effort to be able to complete the most vulnerable points before the arrival of the Lacedaemonians, most of the place being sufficiently strong by nature without further fortifications. Meanwhile the Lacedaemonians were celebrating a festival, and also at first made light of the news, in the idea that whenever they chose to take the field the place would be immediately evacuated by the enemy, or easily taken by force, the absence of their army before Athens having also something to do with their delay. The Athenians fortified the place on the land side, and where it most required it, in 6 days, and leaving Demosthenes with 5 ships to garrison it, with the main body of the fleet, hastened on their voyage to Corcyra and Sicily. As soon as the Peloponnesians in Attica heard of the occupation of Pylos, they hurried back home, the Lacedaemonians and their king Agis thinking that the matter touched them nearly. Besides having made the invasion early in the season, and while the corn was still green, most of their troops were short of provisions. The weather also was unusually bad for the time of year, and greatly distressed their army. Many reasons thus combined to hasten their departure, and to make this invasion a very short one. Indeed, they only stayed 15 days in Attica. About the same time the Athenian general Simonides, getting together a few Athenians from the garrisons and a number of the allies in those parts, took Eion in Thrace, a Mendaean colony and hostile to Athens, by treachery, but had no sooner done so than the Chalcidians and Bottiaeans came up and beat him out of it, with the loss of many of his soldiers. On the return of the Peloponnesians from Attica, the Spartans themselves and the nearest of the Perioeci at once set out for Pylos, the other Lacedaemonians following more slowly, as they had just come in from another campaign. Word was also sent round Peloponnese to come up as quickly as possible to Pylos, while the 60 Peloponnesian ships were sent for from Corcyra, and being dragged by their crews across the isthmus of Leucas, passed unperceived by the Athenian squadrons at Zacynthus, and reached Pylos, where the land forces had arrived before them. Before the Peloponnesian fleet sailed in, Demosthenes found time to send out unobserved 2 ships to inform Eurymedon and the Athenians on board the fleet at Zacynthus of the danger of Pylos, and to summon them to his assistance. While the ships hastened on their voyage in obedience to the orders of Demosthenes, the Lacedaemonians prepared to assault the fort by land and sea, hoping to capture with ease a work constructed in haste and held by a feeble garrison. Meanwhile, as they expected the Athenian ships to arrive from Zacynthus, they intended, if they failed to take the place before, to block up the entrances of the harbour to prevent their being able to anchor inside it. For the island of Sphacteria, stretching along in a line close to the front of the harbour, at once makes it safe and narrows its entrances, leaving a passage for 2 ships on the side nearest Pylos and the Athenian fortifications, and for 8 or 9 on that next the rest of the mainland. For the rest, the island was entirely covered with wood and without paths through not being inhabited, and about 1 mile and 5 furlongs in length. The inlets the Lacedaemonians meant to close with a line of ships placed close together, with their prows turned toward the sea, and meanwhile, fearing that the enemy might make use of the island to operate against them, carried over some heavy infantry thither, stationing others along the coast. By this means the island and the continent would be alike hostile to the Athenians, as they would be unable to land on either, and the shore of Pylos itself outside the inlet toward the open sea having no harbour, and therefore presenting no point which they could use as a base to relieve their countrymen, they, the Lacedaemonians, without sea fight or risk, would in all probability become masters of the place, occupied as it had been on the spur of the moment and unfurnished with provisions. This being determined, they carried over to the island the heavy infantry, drafted by lot from all the companies. Some others had crossed over before in relief parties, but these last who were left there were 420 in number, with their Helot attendants, commanded by Epitadas, son of Melobras. Meanwhile Demosthenes, seeing the Lacedaemonians about to attack him by sea and land at once, himself was not idle. He drew up under the fortification, and enclosed in a stockade the galleys remaining to him of those which had been left him, arming the sailors taken out of them with poor shields, made most of them from osier, it being impossible to procure arms in such a desert place, and even these having been obtained from a 30-oared Messenian privateer, and a boat belonging to some Messenians who happened to have come to them. Among these Messenians were 40 heavy infantry, whom he made use of with the rest. Posting most of his men, unarmed and armed, upon the best fortified and strong points of the place towards the interior, with orders to repel any attack of the land forces, he picked 60 heavy infantry and a few archers from his whole force, and with these went outside the wall down to the sea, where he thought that the enemy would most likely attempt to land. Although the ground was difficult and rocky, looking towards the open sea, the fact that this was the weakest part of the wall would, he thought, encourage their ardour, as the Athenians, confident in their naval superiority, had here paid little attention to their defences, and the enemy, if he could force a landing, might feel secure of taking the place. At this point, accordingly, going down to the water's edge, he posted his heavy infantry to prevent it, if possible, a landing, and encouraged them in the following terms. Soldiers and comrades in this adventure, I hope that none of you in our present strait will think to show his wit by exactly calculating all the perils that encompass us, but that you will rather hasten to close with the enemy without staying to count the odds, seeing in this your best chance of safety. In emergencies like ours, calculation is out of place. The sooner the danger is faced, the better. To my mind also, most of the chances are for us, if we will only stand fast and not throw away our advantages, overawed by the numbers of the enemy. One of the points in our favour is the awkwardness of the landing. This, however, only helps us if we stand our ground. If we give way, it will be practicable enough, in spite of its natural difficulty, without a defender, and the enemy will instantly become more formidable from the difficulty he will have in retreating, supposing that we succeed in repulsing him, which we shall find it easier to do while he is on board his ships than after he has landed and meets us on equal terms. As to his numbers, these need not too much alarm you. Large as they may be, he can only engage in small detachments, from the impossibility of bringing two. Besides, the numerical superiority that we have to meet is not that of an army on land with everything else equal, but of troops on board ship, upon an element where many favourable accidents are required to act with effect. I therefore consider that his difficulties may be fairly set against our numerical deficiencies, and at the same time I charge you, as Athenians who know by experience what landing from ships on hostile territory means, and how impossible it is to drive back an enemy determined enough to stand his ground, and not to be frightened away by the surf and the terrors of the ships sailing in, to stand fast in this present emergency, beat back the enemy at the water's edge, and save yourselves, and the place. Thus encouraged by Demosthenes, the Athenians felt more confident and went down to meet the enemy, posting themselves along the edge of the sea. The Lacedaemonians now put themselves in movement and simultaneously assaulted the fortifications with their land forces and with their ships, 43 in number, under their admiral Thrasymeleidas, son of Cratesicles, a Spartan who made his attack just where Demosthenes expected. The Athenians had thus to defend themselves on both sides, from the land and from the sea, the enemy rowing up in small detachments, the one relieving the other, it being impossible for many to bring two at once, and showing great ardour in cheering each other on in the endeavour to force a passage and to take the fortification. He who most distinguished himself was Brasidas, captain of a galley, and seeing that the captains and steersmen, impressed by the difficulty of the position, hung back even where a landing might have seemed possible for fear of wrecking their vessels, he shouted out to them that they must never allow the enemy to fortify themselves in their country for the sake of saving timber, but must shiver their vessels and force a landing, and bade the allies, instead of hesitating in such a moment, to sacrifice their ships for Lacedaemon in return for her many benefits, to run them boldly aground, land in one way or another, and make themselves master of the place and its garrison. Not content with this exhortation, he forced his own steersman to run his ship ashore, and stepping on to the gangway was endeavouring to land when he was cut down by the Athenians, and after receiving many wounds fainted away. Falling into the bows, his shield slipped off his arm into the sea, and being thrown ashore was picked up by the Athenians, and afterwards used for the trophy which they set up for this attack. The rest also did their best, but were not able to land owing to the difficulty of the ground, and the unflinching tenacity of the Athenians. It was a strange reversal of the order of things for Athenians to be fighting from the land, and from Laconian land too, against Lacedaemonians coming from the sea, while Lacedaemonians were trying to land from shipboard in their own country, now become hostile, to attack Athenians, although the former were chiefly famous at that time as an inland people and superior by land, the latter as a maritime people with a navy that had no equal. After continuing their attacks during that day and most of the next, the Peloponnesians desisted, and the day after sent some of their ships to Asine for timber to make engines, hoping to take by their aid, in spite of its height, the wall opposite the harbour, where the landing was easiest. At this moment the Athenian fleet from Zakynthos arrived, now numbering 50 sail, having been reinforced by some of the ships on guard at Naupactus, and by 4 Chian vessels. Seeing the coast and the island both crowded with heavy infantry, and the hostile ships in harbour showing no signs of sailing out, at a loss where to anchor, they sailed for the moment to the desert island of Prote, not far off, where they passed the night. The next day they got under way in readiness to engage in the open sea if the enemy chose to put out to meet them, being determined in the event of his not doing so to sail in and attack him. The Lacedaemonians did not put out to sea, and having omitted to close the inlets as they had intended, remained quiet on shore, engaged in manning their ships, and getting ready, in case of anyone sailing in, to fight in the harbour, which is a fairly large one. Perceiving this, the Athenians advanced against them by each inlet, and falling on the enemy's fleet, most of which was by this time afloat and in line, at once put it to flight, and giving chase as far as the short distance allowed, disabled a good many vessels, and took 5, one with its crew on board, dashing in at the rest that had taken refuge on shore, and battering some that were still being manned before they could put out, and lashing on to their own ships, and towing off empty others whose crews had fled. At this sight the Lacedaemonians, maddened by a disaster which cut off their men on the island, rushed to the rescue, and going into the sea with their heavy armour, laid hold of the ships, and tried to drag them back, each man thinking that success depended on his individual exertions. Great was the melee, and great in contradiction to the naval tactics usual to the two combatants, the Lacedaemonians in their excitement and dismay being actually engaged in a sea fight on land, while the victorious Athenians, in their eagerness to push their success as far as possible, were carrying on a land fight from their ships. After great exertions and numerous wounds on both sides, they separated, the Lacedaemonians saving their empty ships except those first taken, and both parties returning to their camps. The Athenians set up a trophy, gave back the dead, secured the wrecks, and at once began to cruise round and jealously watch the island, with its intercepted garrison, while the Peloponnesians on the mainland, whose contingents had now all come up, stayed where they were before Pylos. When the news of what had happened at Pylos reached Sparta, the disaster was thought so serious that the Lacedaemonians resolved that the authorities should go down to the camp and decide on the spot what was best to be done. There, seeing that it was impossible to help their men, and not wishing to risk their being reduced by hunger or overpowered by numbers, they determined, with the consent of the Athenian generals, to conclude an armistice at Pylos and send envoys to Athens to obtain a convention, and to endeavour to get back their men as quickly as possible. The generals accepting their offers, an armistice was concluded upon the terms following: that the Lacedaemonians should bring to Pylos and deliver up to the Athenians the ships that had fought in the late engagement, and all in Laconia that were vessels of war, and should make no attack on the fortification either by land or by sea; that the Athenians should allow the Lacedaemonians on the mainland to send the men in the island a certain fixed quantity of corn ready kneaded, that is to say, 2 quarts of barley meal, 1 pint of wine, and a piece of meat for each man, and half the same quantity for a servant; that this allowance should be sent in under the eyes of the Athenians, and that no boat should sail to the island except openly; that the Athenians should continue to the island same as before, without however landing upon it, and should refrain from attacking the Peloponnesian troops either by land or by sea; that if either party should infringe any of these terms in the slightest particular, the armistice should be at once void; that the armistice should hold good until the return of the Lacedaemonian envoys from Athens, the Athenians sending them thither in a galley and bringing them back again, and upon the arrival of the envoys should be at an end, and the ships be restored by the Athenians in the same state as they received them. Such were the terms of the armistice, and the ships were delivered over to the number of 60, and the envoys sent off accordingly. Arrived at Athens, they spoke as follows: Athenians, the Lacedaemonians sent us to try to find some way of settling the affair of our men on the island that shall at once be satisfactory to our interests, and as consistent with our dignity and our misfortune as circumstances permit. We can venture to speak at some length without any departure from the habit of our country. Men of few words where many are not wanted, we can be less brief when there is a matter of importance to be illustrated, and an end to be served by its illustration. Meanwhile, we beg you to take what we may say, not in a hostile spirit, nor as if we thought you ignorant and wished to lecture you, but rather as a suggestion on the best course to be taken, addressed to intelligent judges. You can now, if you choose, employ your present success to advantage, so as to keep what you have got and gain honour and reputation besides, and you can avoid the mistake of those who meet with an extraordinary piece of good fortune, and are led on by hope to grasp continually at something further, through having already succeeded without expecting it; while those who have known most vicissitudes of good and bad have also justly least faith in their prosperity, and to teach your city and ours this lesson experience has not been wanting. To be convinced of this you have only to look at our present misfortune. What power in Hellas stood higher than we did, and yet we are come to you, although we formerly thought ourselves more able to grant what we are now here to ask. Nevertheless, we have not been brought to this by any decay in our power, or through having our heads turned by aggrandizement. No, our resources are what they have always been, and our error has been an error of judgment, to which all are equally liable. Accordingly, the prosperity which your city now enjoys, and the accession that it has lately received, must not make you fancy that fortune will always be with you. Indeed, sensible men are prudent enough to treat their gains as precarious, just as they would also keep a clear head in adversity, and think that war, so far from staying within the limit to which a combatant may wish to confine it, will run the course that its chances prescribe, and thus, not being puffed up by confidence in military success, they are less likely to come to grief, and most ready to make peace, if they can, while their fortune lasts. This, Athenians, you have a good opportunity to do now with us, and thus to escape the possible disasters which may follow upon your refusal, and the consequent imputation of having owed to accident even your present advantages, when you might have left behind you a reputation for power and wisdom which nothing could endanger. The Lacedaemonians accordingly invite you to make a treaty and to end the war, and offer peace and alliance and the most friendly and intimate relations in every way and on every occasion between us, and in return ask for the men on the island. thinking it better for both parties not to stand out to the end, on the chance of some favourable accident enabling the men to force their way out, or of their being compelled to succumb under the pressure of blockade. Indeed, if great enmities are ever to be really settled, we think it will be not by the system of revenge and military success, and by forcing an opponent to swear to a treaty to his disadvantage, but when the more fortunate combatant waives these his privileges, to be guided by gentler feelings, conquers his rival in generosity, and accords peace on more moderate conditions than he expected. From that moment, instead of the debt of revenge which violence must entail, his adversary owes a debt of generosity to be paid in kind, and is inclined by honour to stand to his agreement. And men oftener act in this manner towards their greatest enemies than where the quarrel is of less importance. They are also by nature as glad to give way to those who first yield to them, as they are apt to be provoked by arrogance to risks condemned by their own judgment. To apply this to ourselves, if peace was ever desirable for both parties, it is surely so at the present moment, before anything irremediable befall us and force us to hate you eternally, personally as well as politically, and you to miss the advantages that we now offer you. While the issue is still in doubt and you have reputation and our friendship in prospect, and we the compromise of our misfortune before anything fatal occur, let us be reconciled, and for ourselves choose peace instead of war, and grant to the rest of Hellenes a remission from their sufferings, for which be sure they will think they have chiefly you to thank. The war that they labour under they know not which began, but the peace that concludes it, as it depends on your decision, will by their gratitude be laid at your door. By such a decision you can become firm friends with the Lacedaemonians at their own invitation, which you do not force from them, but oblige them by accepting. And from this friendship consider the advantages that are likely to follow. When Attica and Sparta are at one, the rest of Hellas, be sure, will remain in respectful inferiority before its heads. Such were the words of the Lacedaemonians, their idea being that the Athenians, already desirous of a truce and only kept back by their opposition, would joyfully accept a peace freely offered and give back the men. The Athenians, however, having the men on the island, thought that the treaty would be ready for them whenever they chose to make it, and grasped at something further. Foremost to encourage them in this policy was Cleon, son of Cleonetus, a popular leader of the time and very powerful with the multitude, who persuaded them to answer as follows. First, the men in the island must surrender themselves and their arms and be brought to Athens. Next, the Lacedaemonians must restore Nicaea, Pegae, Troezen, and Achaea, all places acquired not by arms, but by the previous convention, under which they had been ceded by Athens herself at a moment of disaster, when a truce was more necessary to her than at present. This done, they might take back their men and make a truce for as long as both parties might agree. To this answer the envoys made no reply, but asked that commissioners might be chosen with whom they might confer on each point, and quietly talk the matter over and try to come to some agreement. Hereupon Cleon violently assailed them, saying that he knew from the first that they had no right intentions, and that it was clear enough now by their refusing to speak before the people and wanting to confer in secret with a committee of 2 or 3. No, if they meant anything honest, let them say it out before all. The Lacedaemonians, however, seeing that whatever concessions they might be prepared to make in their misfortune, it was impossible for them to speak before the multitude and lose credit with their allies for a negotiation which might after all miscarry, and on the other hand, that the Athenians would never grant what they asked upon moderate terms, returned from Athens without having effected anything. Their arrival at once put an end to the armistice at Pylos, and the Lacedaemonians asked back their ships according to the convention. The Athenians, however, alleged an attack on the fort in contravention of the truce, and other grievances seemingly not worth mentioning, and refused to give them back, insisting upon the clause by which the slightest infringement made the armistice void. The Lacedaemonians, after denying the contravention and protesting against their bad faith in the matter of the ships, went away and earnestly addressed themselves to the war. Hostilities were now carried on at Pylos upon both sides with vigour. The Athenians cruised round the island all day with 2 ships going different ways, and by night, except on the seaward side in windy weather, anchored round it with their whole fleet, which, having been reinforced by 20 ships from Athens come to aid in the blockade, now numbered 70 sail, while the Peloponnesians remained encamped on the continent, making attacks on the fort, and on the lookout for any opportunity which might offer itself for the deliverance of their men. Meanwhile the Syracusans and their allies in Sicily had brought up to the squadron guarding Messina the reinforcement which we left them preparing, and carried on the war from thence, incited chiefly by the Locrians from hatred of the Rhegians, whose territory they had invaded with all their forces. The Syracusans also wished to try their fortune at sea, seeing that the Athenians had only a few ships actually at Rhegium, and hearing that the main fleet destined to join them was engaged in blockading the island. A naval victory, they thought, would enable them to blockade Rhegium by sea and land, and easily to reduce it, a success which would at once place their affairs upon a solid basis, the promontory of Rhegium in Italy and Messina in Sicily being so near each other that it would be impossible for the Athenians to cruise against them and command the strait. The strait in question consists of the sea between Rhegium and Messina, at the point where Sicily approaches nearest to the continent, and is the Charybdis through which the story makes Ulysses sail, and the narrowness of the passage and the strength of the current that pours in from the vast Tyrrhenian and Sicilian mains have rightly given it a bad reputation. In this strait the Syracusans and their allies were compelled to fight, late in the day, about the passage of a boat, putting out with rather more than 30 ships against 60 Athenians and 8 Rhegian vessels. Defeated by the Athenians, they hastily set off each for himself to their own stations at Messina and Rhegium, with the loss of 1 ship, night coming on before the battle was finished. After this the Locrians retired from the Rhegian territory, and the ships of the Syracusans and their allies united and came to anchor at Cape Pelorus, in the territory of Messina, where their land forces joined them. Here the Athenians and Rhegians sailed up, and seeing the ships unmanned, made an attack, in which they in turn lost 1 vessel, which was caught by a grappling iron, the crew saving themselves by swimming. After this the Syracusans got on board their ships, and while they were being towed along shore to Messina, were again attacked by the Athenians, but suddenly got out to sea and became the assailants, and caused them to lose another vessel. After thus holding their own in the voyage along shore and in the engagement as above described, the Syracusans sailed on into the harbour of Messina. Meanwhile the Athenians, having received warning that Camarina was about to be betrayed to the Syracusans by Archias and his party, sailed thither, and the Messinese took this opportunity to attack by sea and land with all their forces their Chalcidian neighbour Naxos. The first day they forced the Naxians to keep their walls and laid waste their country. The next they sailed round with their ships and laid waste the land on the river Acesines, while their land forces menaced the city. Meanwhile the Sicels came down from the high country in great numbers to aid against the Messinese, and the Naxians, elated at the sight and animated by a belief that the Leontines and their other Hellenic allies were coming to their support, suddenly sallied out from the town and attacked and routed the Messinese, killing more than 1,000 of them, while the remainder suffered severely in their retreat home, being attacked by the barbarians on the road, and most of them cut off. The ships put into Messina and afterwards dispersed for their different homes. The Leontines and their allies, with the Athenians, upon this at once turned their arms against the now weakened Messina, and attacked, the Athenians with their ships on the one side of the harbour, and the land forces on that of the town. The Messinese, however, sallying out with Damatoles and some Locrians who had been left to garrison the city after the disaster, suddenly attacked and routed most of the Leontine army, killing a great number, upon seeing which the Athenians landed from their ships, and falling on the Messinese in disorder, chased them back into the town, and setting up a trophy, retired to Rhegium. After this the Hellenes in Sicily continued to make war on each other by land without the Athenians. Meanwhile the Athenians at Pylos were still besieging the Lacedaemonians in the island, the Peloponnesian forces on the continent remaining where they were. The blockade was very laborious from the Athenians for want of food and water. There was no spring except one in the citadel of Pylos itself, and that not a large one, and most of them were obliged to grub up the shingle on the sea beach and drink such water as they could find. They also suffered from want of room, being encamped in a narrow space, and as there was no anchorage for the ships, some took their meals on shore in their turn, while the others were anchored out at sea. But their greatest discouragement arose from the unexpectedly long time which it took to reduce a body of men shut up in a desert island, with only brackish water to drink, a matter which they had imagined would take them only a few days. The fact was that the Lacedaemonians had made an advertisement for volunteers to carry into the island ground corn, wine, cheese, and any other food useful in a siege, high prices being offered, and freedom promised to any of the Helots who should succeed in doing so. The Helots accordingly were most forward to engage in this risky traffic, putting off from this or that part of Peloponnese, and running in by night on the seaward side of the island. They were best pleased, however, when they could catch a wind to carry them in. It was more easy to elude the lookouts of the galleys when it blew from the seaward, as it became impossible for them to anchor round the island, while the Helots had their boats rated at their value in money, and ran them ashore, without caring how they landed, being sure to find the soldiers waiting for them at the landing places. But all who risked it in fair weather were taken. Divers also swam in under water from the harbour, dragging by a cord in skins poppy seed mixed with honey, and bruised linseed. These at first escaped notice, but afterwards a lookout was kept for them. In short, both sides tried every possible contrivance, the one to throw in provisions, the other to prevent their introduction. At Athens, meanwhile, the news that the army was in great distress, and that corn found its way into the men on the island, caused no small perplexity, and the Athenians began to fear that winter might come on and find them still engaged in the blockade. They saw that the convoying of provisions round Peloponnese would then be impossible. The country offered no resources in itself, and even in summer they could not send round enough. The blockade of a place without harbours could no longer be kept up, and the men would either escape by the siege being abandoned, or would watch for bad weather and sail out in the boats that brought in their corn. What caused still more alarm was the attitude of the Lacedaemonians, who must, it was thought by the Athenians, feel themselves on strong ground not to send them any more envoys, and they began to repent having rejected the treaty. Cleon, perceiving the disfavour with which he was regarded for having stood in the way of the convention, now said that their informants did not speak the truth, and upon the messengers recommending them, if they did not believe them, to send some commissioners to see, Cleon himself and Theagenes were chosen by the Athenians as commissioners. Aware that he would now be obliged either to say what had been already said by the men whom he was slandering, or be proved a liar if he said the contrary, he told the Athenians, whom he saw to be not altogether disinclined for a fresh expedition, that instead of sending and wasting their time and opportunities, if they believed what was told them, they ought to sail against the men. And pointing at Nicias, son of Niceratus, then general, whom he hated, he tauntingly said that it would be easy, if they had men for generals, to sail with a force and take those in the island, and that if he had himself been in command, he would have done it. Nicias, seeing the Athenians murmuring against Cleon for not sailing now if it seemed him so easy, and further seeing himself the object of attack, told him that for all the generals cared, he might take what force he chose and make the attempt. At first Cleon fancied that this resignation was merely a figure of speech, and was ready to go, but finding that it was seriously meant, he drew back, and said that Nicias, not he, was general, being now frightened, and having never supposed that Nicias would go so far as to retire in his favour. Nicias, however, repeated his offer, and resigned the command against Pylos, and called the Athenians to witness that he did so. And as the multitude is wont to do, the more Cleon shrank from the expedition and tried to back out of what he had said, the more they encouraged Nicias to hand over his command, and clamoured at Cleon to go. At last, not knowing how to get out of his words, he undertook the expedition, and came forward and said that he was not afraid of the Lacedaemonians, but would sail without taking any one from the city with him, except the Lemnians and Imbrians that were at Athens, with some targeteers that had come up from Aeneas, and 400 archers from other quarters. With these and the soldiers at Pylos, he would within 20 days either bring the Lacedaemonians alive, or kill them on the spot. The Athenians could not help laughing at this fatuity, while sensible men comforted themselves with the reflection that they must gain in either circumstance. Either they would be rid of Cleon, which they rather hoped, or if disappointed in this expectation, would reduce the Lacedaemonians. After he had settled everything in the assembly, and the Athenians had voted him the command of the expedition, he chose as his colleague Demosthenes, one of the generals at Pylos, and pushed forward the preparations for his voyage. His choice fell upon Demosthenes because he heard that he was contemplating a descent on the island. The soldiers, distressed by the difficulties of the position, and rather besieged than besiegers, being eager to fight it out, while the firing of the island had increased the confidence of the general. He had been at first afraid because the island, having never been inhabited, was almost entirely covered with wood and without paths, thinking this to be in the enemy's favour, as he might land with a large force, and yet might suffer loss by an attack from an unseen position. The mistakes and forces of the enemy the wood would be in great measure conceal from him, while every blunder of his own troops would be at once detected, and they would thus be able to fall upon him unexpectedly, just where they pleased, the attack being always in their power. If, on the other hand, he should force them to engage in the thicket, the smaller number who knew the country would, he thought, have advantage over the larger who were ignorant of it, while his own army might be cut off imperceptibly, in spite of its numbers, as the men would not be able to see where to succour each other. The Aetolian disaster, which had been mainly caused by the wood, had not a little to do with these reflections. Meanwhile, one of the soldiers who were compelled by want of room to land on the extremities of the island and take their dinners, with outposts fixed to prevent a surprise, set fire to a little of the wood without meaning to do so, and as it came on to blow soon afterward, almost the whole was consumed before they were aware of it. Demosthenes was now able for the first time to see how numerous the Lacedaemonians really were, having up to this moment been under the impression that they took in provisions for a smaller number. He also saw that the Athenians thought success important and were anxious about it, and that it was now easier to land on the island, and accordingly got ready for the attempt, sent for troops from the allies in the neighbourhood, and pushed forward his other preparations. At this moment Cleon arrived in Pylos with the troops which he had asked for, having sent on word to say that he was coming. The first step taken by the two generals after their meeting was to send a herald to the camp on the mainland, and to ask if they were disposed to avoid all risk, and to order the men on the island to surrender themselves and their arms, to be kept in gentle custody until some general convention should be concluded. On the rejection of this proposition, the generals let 1 day pass, and the next, embarking all their heavy infantry on board a few ships, put out by night, and a little before dawn landed on both sides of the island from the open sea and from the harbour, being about 800 strong, and advanced with a run against the first post in the island. The enemy had distributed his force as follows. In the first post there were about 30 heavy infantry. The centre and most level part, where the water was held by the main body, and by Epitadas their commander, while a small party guarded the very end of the island toward Pylos, which was precipitous on the seaside, and very difficult to attack from the land, and where there was also a sort of old fort of stones rudely put together, which they thought might be useful to them, in case they should be forced to retreat. Such was their disposition. The advanced post thus attacked by the Athenians was at once put to the sword, the men being scarcely out of bed and still arming, the landing having taken them by surprise, as they fancied the ships were only sailing as usual to their stations for the night. As soon as day broke, the rest of the army landed, that is to say, all the crews of rather more than 70 ships, except the lowest rank of oars, with the arms they carried, 800 archers, and as many targeteers, the Messenian reinforcements, and all the other troops on duty round Pylos except the garrison of the fort. The tactics of Demosthenes had divided them into companies of 200 more or less, and made them occupy the highest points in order to paralyze the enemy by surrounding him on every side, and thus leaving him, without any tangible adversary, exposed to the crossfire of their host, plied by those in his rear if he attacked in front, and by those on one flank if he moved against those on the other. In short, wherever he went he would have assailants behind him, and these light-armed assailants the most awkward of all. Arrows, darts, stones, and slings making them formidable at a distance, and there being no means of getting at them in close quarters as they could conquer flying, and the moment their pursuer turned they were upon him. Such was the idea that inspired Demosthenes in his conception of the descent, and presided over its execution. Meanwhile the main body of the troops in the island, that is, that under Epitadas, seeing their outpost cut off and an army advancing against them, serried their ranks and pressed forward to close with the Athenian heavy infantry in front of them, the light troops being upon their flanks and rear. However, they were not able to engage or profit by their superior skill, the light troops keeping them in check on either side with their missiles, and the heavy infantry remaining stationary instead of advancing to meet them. And although they routed the light troops wherever they ran up and approached too closely, yet they retreated fighting, being lightly equipped, and easily getting the start in their flight, from the difficult and rugged nature of the ground in an island hitherto desert, over which the Lacedaemonians could not pursue them with their heavy armour. After the skirmishing had lasted some little while, the Lacedaemonians became unable to dash out with the same rapidity as before upon the points attacked, and the light troops, finding that they now fought with less vigour, became more confident. They could see with their own eyes that they were many times more numerous than the enemy. They were now more familiar with his aspect, and found him less terrible, the result not having justified the apprehensions which they had suffered, when they first landed in slavish dismay at the idea of attacking Lacedaemonians, and accordingly their fear changing to disdain, they now rushed all together with loud shouts upon them, and pelted them with stones, darts, and arrows, whichever came first to hand. The shouting accompanying their onset confounded the Lacedaemonians, unaccustomed to this mode of fighting. Dust rose from the newly burnt wood, and it was impossible to see in front of one with the arrows and stones flying through clouds of dust from the hands of numerous assailants. The Lacedaemonians had now to sustain a rude conflict. Their caps would not keep out the arrows, darts had broken off in the armour of the wounded, while they themselves were helpless for offence, being prevented from using their eyes to see what was before them, and unable to hear the word of command for the hubbub raised by the enemy. Danger encompassed them on every side, and there was no hope of any means of defence or safety. At last, after many had already been wounded in the confined space in which they were fighting, They formed in close order and retired on the fort at the end of the island, which was not far off, and to their friends who held it. The moment they gave way, the light troops became bolder and pressed upon them, shouting louder than ever, and killed as many as they came up with in their retreat, but most of the Lacedaemonians made good their escape to the fort, and with it the garrison ranged themselves all along its whole extent to repulse the enemy wherever it was assailable. The Athenians pursuing, unable to surround and hem them in owing to the strength of the ground, attacked them in front and tried to storm the position. For a long time indeed, for most of the day, both sides held out against all torments of the battle, thirst and sun, the one endeavouring to drive the enemy from the high ground, the other to maintain himself upon it being now more easy for the Lacedaemonians to defend themselves than before, as they could not be surrounded on the flanks. The struggle began to seem endless when the commander of the Messenians came to Cleon and Demosthenes and told them that they were losing their labour, but if they would give him some archers and light troops to go round the enemy's rear by a way he would undertake to find, he thought he could force the approach. Upon receiving what he asked for, he started from a point out of sight in order not to be seen by the enemy, and creeping on wherever the precipices of the island permitted, and where the Lacedaemonians, trusting to the strength of the ground, kept no guard, succeeded after the greatest difficulty in getting round without their seeing him, and suddenly appeared on the high ground in their rear, to the dismay of the surprised enemy, and the still greater joy of his expectant friends. The Lacedaemonians, thus placed between two fires, and in the same dilemma to compare small things with great, as at Thermopylae, where the defenders were cut off through the Persians getting round the path, being now attacked in front and behind, began to give way, and overcome by the odds against them, and exhausted from want of food, retreated. The Athenians were already masters of the approaches when Cleon and Demosthenes, perceiving that if the enemy gave way a single step further they would be destroyed by their soldiery, put a stop to the battle and held their men back, wishing to take the Lacedaemonians alive to Athens, and hoping that their stubbornness might relax on hearing the offer of terms, and that they might surrender and yield to the present overwhelming danger. Proclamation was accordingly made to know if they would surrender themselves and their arms to the Athenians to be dealt with at their discretion. The Lacedaemonians hearing this offer, most of them lowered their shields and waved their hands to show that they accepted it. Hostilities now ceased, and a parley was held between Cleon and Demosthenes and Styphon, son of Pharax, on the other side, since Epitadas, the first of the previous commanders, had been killed, and Hippogretas, the next in command, left for dead among the slain, though still alive, and thus the command had devolved upon Styphon according to the law, in case of anything happening to his superiors. Styphon and his companions said they wished to send a herald to the Lacedaemonians on the mainland to know what they were to do. The Athenians would not let any of them go, but themselves called for heralds from the mainland, and after questions had been carried backwards and forwards 2 or 3 times, the last men that passed over from the Lacedaemonians on the continent brought this message: "The Lacedaemonians bid you to decide for yourselves, so long as you do nothing dishonourable." Upon which, after consulting together, they surrendered themselves and their arms. The Athenians, after guarding them that day and night, the next morning set up a trophy in the island, and got ready to sail, giving their prisoners in batches to be guarded by the captains of the galleys, and the Lacedaemonians sent a herald and took up their dead. The number of the killed and prisoners taken in the island was as follows: 420 heavy infantry passed over, 300 all but 8 were taken alive to Athens, the rest were killed. About 120 of the prisoners were Spartans. The Athenian loss was small, the battle not having been fought at close quarters. The blockade in all, counting from the fight at sea to the battle in the island, had lasted 72 days. For 20 of these, during the absence of the envoys sent to treat for peace, the men had provisions given them, for the rest they were fed by the smugglers. Corn and other victual was found in the island, the commander Epitadas having kept the men upon half rations. The Athenians and Peloponnesians now each withdrew their forces from Pylos and went home, and crazy as Cleon's promise was, he fulfilled it by bringing the men to Athens within the 20 days, as he had pledged himself to do. Nothing that happened in the war surprised the Hellenes so much as this. It was the opinion that no force or famine could make the Lacedaemonians give up their arms, but that they would fight on as they could and die with them in their hands. Indeed, people could scarcely believe that those who had surrendered were of the same stuff as the fallen, and an Athenian ally, who some time after insultingly asked one of the prisoners from the island if those that had fallen were men of honour, received for answer that the atraktos, that is the arrow, would be worth a great deal if it could tell men of honour from the rest, in allusion to the fact that the killed were those whom the stones and arrows happened to hit. Upon the arrival of the men, the Athenians determined to keep them in prison until the peace, and if the Peloponnesians invaded their country in the interval, to bring them out and put them to death. Meanwhile, the defence of Pylos was not forgotten. The Messenians from Naupactus sent to their old country, to which Pylos formerly belonged, some of the likeliest of their number, and began a series of incursions into Laconia, which their common dialect rendered most destructive. The Lacedaemonians, hitherto without experience of incursions or a warfare of the kind, finding the Helots deserting and fearing the march of revolution in their country, began to be seriously uneasy, and in spite of their unwillingness to betray this to the Athenians, began to send envoys to Athens, and tried to recover Pylos and the prisoners. The Athenians, however, kept grasping at more, and dismissed envoy after envoy without their having effected anything. Such was the history of the affair of Pylos. This is the end of chapter 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. The Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. Translated by Richard Crawley. Book 4, Chapter 13. The same summer, directly after these events, the Athenians made an expedition against the territory of Corinth, with 80 ships and 2,000 Athenian heavy infantry, and 200 cavalry on board horse transports, accompanied by the Milesians, Andrians, and Carystians from the allies, under the command of Nicias, son of Niceratus, with 2 colleagues. Putting out to sea, they made land at daybreak between Chersonese and Rhytus, at the beach of the country underneath the Solygian hill, upon which the Dorians in old times established themselves and carried on war against the Aeolian inhabitants of Corinth, and where a village now stands, called Solygia. The beach where the fleet came to is about 1.5 miles from the village, 7 miles from Corinth, and 2.25 miles from the isthmus. The Corinthians had heard from Argos of the coming of the Athenian armament, and had all come up the isthmus long before, with the exception of those who lived beyond it, and also of 500 who were away in garrison in Ambracia and Leucadia, and they were there in full force watching for the Athenians to land. These last, however, gave them the slip by coming in the dark, and being informed by signals of the fact that the Corinthians left half their number at Cenchreae, in case the Athenians should go against Crommyon, and marched in all haste to the rescue. Battus, one of the 2 generals present at the action, went with a company to defend the village of Solygia, which was unfortified. Lycophron remained to give battle with the rest. The Corinthians first attacked the right wing of the Athenians, which had just landed in front of Chersonese, and afterwards the rest of the army. The battle was an obstinate one, and fought throughout hand to hand. The right wing of the Athenians and Carystians, who had been placed at the end of the line, received, and with some difficulty repulsed the Corinthians, who thereupon retreated to a wall upon the rising ground behind, and throwing down the stones upon them, came on again singing the paean, and being received by the Athenians, were again engaged at close quarters. At this moment a Corinthian company, having come to the relief of the left wing, routed and pursued the Athenian right to the sea, whence they were in their turn driven back by the Athenians and Carystians from the ships. Meanwhile the rest of the army on either side fought on tenaciously, especially the right wing of the Corinthians, where Lycophron sustained the attack of the Athenian left, which it was feared might attempt the village of Solygia. After holding on for a long while without either giving way, the Athenians, aided by their horse, of which the enemy had none, at length routed the Corinthians, who retired to the hill, and halting, remained quiet there, without coming down again. It was in this rout of the right wing that they had the most killed, Lycophron their general being among the number. The rest of the army, broken and put to flight in this way without being seriously pursued or hurried, retired to the high ground, and there took up its position. The Athenians, finding that the enemy no longer offered to engage them, stripped his dead and took up their own, and immediately set up a trophy. Meanwhile the half of the Corinthians left at Cenchreae to guard against the Athenians sailing on Crommyon, although unable to see the battle from Mount Oeneon, found out what was going on by the dust and hurried up to the rescue, as did also the older Corinthians from the town, upon discovering what had occurred. The Athenians, seeing them all coming against them, and thinking that they were reinforcements arriving from the neighbouring Peloponnesians, withdrew in haste to their ships with their spoils and their own dead, except 2 that they left behind, not being able to find them, and going on board crossed over to the islands opposite, and from thence sent a herald, and took up under truce the bodies which they had left behind. 212 Corinthians fell in the battle, and rather less than 50 Athenians.
Weighing from the islands, the Athenians sailed the same day to Crommyon in the Corinthian territory, about 13 miles from the city, and coming to anchor laid waste the country and passed the night there. The next day, after first coasting along to the territory of Epidaurus and making a descent there, they came to Methana between Epidaurus and Troezen, and drew a wall across and fortified the isthmus of the peninsula, and left a post there from which incursions were henceforth made upon the country of Troezen, Haliae, and Epidaurus. After walling off this spot, the fleet sailed off home. While these events were going on, Eurymedon and Sophocles had put to sea with the Athenian fleet from Pylos on their way to Sicily, and arriving at Corcyra joined the townsmen in an expedition against the party established on Mount Istone, who had crossed over, as I've mentioned, after the revolution and become masters of the country, to the great hurt of the inhabitants. Their stronghold having been taken by an attack, the garrison took refuge in a body upon some high ground, and there capitulated, agreeing to give up their mercenary auxiliaries, lay down their arms, and commit themselves to the discretion of the Athenian people. The generals carried them across under truce to the island of Ptychia, to be kept in custody until they could be sent to Athens, upon the understanding that, if any were caught running away, all would lose the benefit of the treaty. Meanwhile, the leaders of the Corcyrian commons, afraid that the Athenians might spare the lives of the prisoners, had recourse to the following stratagem. They gained over some few men on the island by secretly sending friends with instructions to provide them with a boat, and to tell them, as if for their own sakes, that they had best escape as quickly as possible, as the Athenian generals were going to give them up to the Corcyrian people. These representations succeeding, it was so arranged that the men were caught sailing out in the boat that was provided, and the treaty became void accordingly, and the whole body were given up to the Corcyrians. For this result the Athenian generals were in a great measure responsible, their evident disinclination to sail for Sicily, and thus to leave to others the honour of conducting the men to Athens, encouraged the intriguers in their design, and seemed to affirm the truth of their representations. The prisoners thus handed over were shut up by the Corcyrians in a large building, and afterwards taken out by 20s, and led past 2 lines of heavy infantry, one on each side, being bound together, and beaten and stabbed by the men in the lines, whenever any saw pass a personal enemy, while men carrying whips went by their side and hastened on the road those that walked too slowly. As many as 60 men were taken out and killed in this way without the knowledge of their friends in the building, who fancied they were merely being moved from one prison to another. At last, however, someone opened their eyes to the truth, upon which they called upon the Athenians to kill them themselves, if such was their pleasure, and refusing any longer to go out of the building, and said that they would do all they could to prevent anyone coming in. The Corcyrians, not liking themselves to force a passage by the doors, got up on top of the building, and breaking through the roof, threw down the tiles and let fly arrows at them, from which the prisoners sheltered themselves as well as they could. Most of their number, meanwhile, were engaged in dispatching themselves, by thrusting into their throats the arrows shot by the enemy, and hanging themselves with the cords taken from some beds that happened to be there, and with strips made from their clothing, adopting, in short, every possible means of self-destruction, and also falling victims to the missiles of their enemies on the roof. Night came on while these horrors were enacting, and most of it had passed before they were concluded. And when it was day, the Corcyrians threw them in layers upon wagons and carried them out of the city. All the women taken in the stronghold were sold as slaves. In this way the Corcyrians of the mountain were destroyed by the commons, and so, after terrible excesses, the party strife came to an end, and at least as far as the period of this war is concerned, for of one party there was practically nothing left. Meanwhile the Athenians sailed off to Sicily, their primary destination, and carried on the war with their allies there. At the close of the summer the Athenians at Naupactus and the Acarnanians made an expedition against Anactorium, the Corinthian town lying at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf, and took it by treachery, and the Acarnanians themselves, sending settlers from all parts of Acarnania, occupied the place. Summer was now over. During the winter ensuing, Aristides, son of Archippus, one of the commanders of the Athenian ships sent to collect money from the allies, arrested at Eion, on the Strymon, Artaphernes, a Persian, on his way from the king to Lacedaemon. He was conducted to Athens, where the Athenians got his dispatches translated from the Assyrian characters, and read them. With numerous references to other subjects, they in substance told the Lacedaemonians that the king did not know what they wanted, as of the many ambassadors they had sent him, no 2 ever told the same story. If, however, they were prepared to speak plainly, they might send him some envoys with this Persian. The Athenians afterwards sent back Artaphernes in a galley to Ephesus, and ambassadors with him, who heard there of the death of King Artaxerxes, son of Xerxes, which took place about that time, and so returned home. The same winter the Chians pulled down their new wall at the command of the Athenians, who suspected them of meditating an insurrection, after first, however, obtaining pledges from the Athenians, and security, as far as this was possible, for their continuing to treat them as before. Thus the winter ended, and with it ended the 7th year of this war, of which Thucydides is the historian. In the first days of the next summer there was an eclipse of the sun at the time of new moon, and in the early part of the same month an earthquake. Meanwhile the Mytilenean and other Lesbian exiles set out, for the most part from the continent, with mercenaries hired in Peloponnese, and others levied on the spot, and took Rhoetium, but restored it without injury on the receipt of 2,000 Phocaean staters. After this they marched against Antandrus, and took the town by treachery, their plan being to free Antandrus and the rest of the Actaean towns, formerly owned by Mytilene but now held by the Athenians. Once fortified there, they would have every facility for shipbuilding from the vicinity of Ida, and the consequent abundance of timber, and plenty of other supplies, and might from this base easily ravage Lesbos, which was not far off, and make themselves masters of the Aeolian towns on the continent. While these were the schemes of the exiles, the Athenians in the same summer made an expedition with 60 ships, 2,000 heavy infantry, a few cavalry, and some allied troops from Miletus and other parts against Cythera, under the command of Nicias, son of Niceratus, Nicostratus, son of Diotrephes, and Autocles, son of Ptolemaeus. Cythera is an island lying off Laconia, opposite Malea. The inhabitants are Lacedaemonians of the class of the Perioeci, and an officer called the judge of Cythera went over to the place annually from Sparta. A garrison of heavy infantry was also regularly sent there, and great attention paid to the island, as it was the landing place for the merchantmen from Egypt and Libya, and at the same time secured Laconia from the attacks of privateers from the sea, at the only point where it is assailable, as the whole coast rises abruptly toward the Sicilian and Cretan seas. Coming to land here with their armament, the Athenians with 10 ships and 2,000 Milesian heavy infantry took the town of Scandia on the sea, and with the rest of their forces landing on the side of the island looking towards Malea, went against the lower town of Cythera, where they found all the inhabitants encamped. A battle ensuing, the Cytherians held their ground for some little while, and then turned and fled into the upper town, where they soon afterwards capitulated to Nicias and his colleagues, agreeing to leave their fate to the decision of the Athenians, their lives only being safe. A correspondence had previously been going on between Nicias and certain of the inhabitants, which caused the surrender to be effected more speedily, and upon terms more advantageous present and future for the Cytherians, who would otherwise have been expelled by the Athenians on account of their being Lacedaemonians, and their island being so near to Laconia. After the capitulation, the Athenians occupied the town of Scandia near the harbour, and appointing a garrison for Cythera, sailed to Acini, Hellas, and most of the places on the sea, and making descents and passing the night on shore at such spots as were convenient, continued ravaging the country for about 7 days. The Lacedaemonians, seeing the Athenians masters of Cythera, and expecting descents of the kind upon their coasts, nowhere opposed them in force, but sent garrisons here and there through the country, consisting of as many heavy infantry as the points menaced seemed to require, and generally stood very much upon the defensive. After the severe and unexpected blow that had befallen them in the island, the occupation of Pylos and Cythera, and the apparition on every side of a war whose rapidly defied precaution, they lived in constant fear of internal revolution, and now took the unusual step of raising 400 horse and a force of archers, and became more timid than ever in military matters, finding themselves involved in a maritime struggle, which their organization had never contemplated, and that against Athenians, with whom an enterprise unattempted was always looked upon as a success sacrificed. Besides this, their late numerous reverses of fortune, coming close upon one another without any reason, had thoroughly unnerved them, and they were always afraid of a second disaster like that on the island, and thus scarcely dared to take the field, but fancied that they could not stir without a blunder, for being new to the experience of adversity, they had lost all confidence in themselves. Accordingly, they now allowed the Athenians to ravage their seaboard without making any movement, the garrisons in whose neighbourhood the descents were made, always thinking their numbers insufficient, and sharing the general feeling. A single garrison which ventured to resist, near Cotyrta and Aphrodisia, struck terror by its charge into the scattered mob of light troops, but retreated, upon being received by the heavy infantry, with the loss of a few men and some arms, for which the Athenians set up a trophy, and then sailed off to Cythera. From thence they sailed round to Epidaurus Limera, ravaged part of the country, and so came to Thyrea in the Canurian territory, upon the Argive and Laconian border. This district had been given by its Lacedaemonian owners to the expelled Aeginetans to inhabit, in return for their good offices at the time of the earthquake and the rising of the Helots, and also because, although subject of Athens, they had always sided with Lacedaemon. While the Athenians were still at sea, the Aeginetans evacuated a fort which they were building upon the coast and retreated into the upper town where they lived, rather more than a mile from the sea. One of the Lacedaemonian district garrisons, which was helping them in the work, refused to enter here with them at their entreaty, thinking it dangerous to shut themselves up within the wall, and retiring to the high ground remained quiet, not considering themselves a match for the enemy. Meanwhile the Athenians landed and instantly advanced with all their forces and took Thyrea. The town they burnt, pillaging what was in it. The Aeginetans who were not slain in action they took with them to Athens, with Tantalus, son of Patroclus, their Lacedaemonian commander, who had been wounded and taken prisoner. They also took with them a few men from Cythera, whom they thought it safest to remove. These the Athenians determined to lodge in the islands. The rest of the Cytherians were to retain their lands and pay 4 talents tribute, the Aeginetans captured to be all put to death on account of the old inveterate feud, and Tantalus to share the imprisonment of the Lacedaemonians taken on the island. That same summer, the inhabitants of Camarina and Gela in Sicily first made an armistice with each other, after which embassies from all the other Sicilian cities assembled at Gela to try to bring about a pacification. After many expressions of opinion on one side and the other, according to the griefs and pretensions of the different parties complaining, Hermocrates, son of Hermon, a Syracusan, the most influential man among them, addressed the following words to the assembly. If I now address you, Sicilians, it is not because my city is the least in Sicily, or the greatest sufferer by the war, but in order to state publicly what appears to me to be the best policy for the whole island. That war is an evil is a proposition so familiar to everyone that it would be tedious to develop it. No one is forced to engage in it by ignorance or kept out of it by fear if he fancies there is anything to be gained by it. To the former the gain appears greater than the danger, while the latter would rather stand the risk than put up with any immediate sacrifice. But if both should happen to have chosen the wrong moment for acting in this way, advice to make peace would not be unserviceable, and this, if we did but see it, is just what we stand most in need of at the present juncture. I suppose that no one will dispute that we went to war at first in order to serve our own several interests, that we are now, in view of the same interests, debating how we can make peace, and that if we separate without having as we think our rights, we shall go to war again. And yet, as men of sense, we ought to see that our separate interests are not alone at stake in the present Congress. There is also the question whether we still have time to save Sicily, the whole of which, in my opinion, is menaced by Athenian ambition. And we ought to find in the name of that people more imperious arguments for peace than any which I can advance, when we see that the first power in Hellas watching our mistakes with the few ships that she has at present in our waters, and under the fair name of alliance speciously seeking to turn to account the natural hostility that exists between us. If we go to war and call in to help us a people that are ready enough to carry their arms even where they're not invited, and if we injure ourselves at our own expense, and at the same time serve as the pioneers of their dominion, we may expect, when they see us worn out, that they will one day come with a larger armament, and seek to bring all of us into subjection. And yet, as sensible men, if we call in allies and court danger, it should be in order to enrich our different countries with new acquisitions, and not to ruin what they possess already. And we should understand that the intestine discords which are so fatal to communities generally will be equally so to Sicily, if we, its inhabitants, absorbed in our local quarrels, neglect the common enemy. These considerations should reconcile individual with individual and city with city, and unite us in a common effort to save the whole of Sicily. Nor should anyone imagine that the Dorians only are enemies of Athens, while the Chalcidian race is secured by its Ionian blood. The attack in question is not inspired by hatred of one of two nationalities, but by desire for the good things in Sicily, the common property of us all. This is proved by the Athenian reception of the Chalcidian invitation. An ally who has never given them any assistance whatever at once receives from them almost more than the treaty entitles him to. That the Athenians should cherish this ambition and practice this policy is very excusable, and I do not blame those who wish to rule, but those who are over-ready to serve. It is just as much in men's nature to rule those who submit to them, as it is to resist those who molest them. One is not less invariable than the other. Meanwhile, all who see these dangers and refuse to provide for them properly, or who have come here without having made up their minds that our first duty is to unite to get rid of the common peril, are mistaken. The quickest way to be rid of it is to make peace with each other, since the Athenians menace us not from their own country, but from that of those who invited them here. In this way, instead of peace issuing in war, peace quietly ends our quarrels, and the guests who come hither under fair pretenses for bad ends will have good reason for going away without having attained them. So far as regards the Athenians, such are the great advantages proved inherent in a wise policy. Independently of this, in the face of the universal consent that peace is the first of blessings, how can we refuse to make it amongst ourselves? Or do you not think that the good which you have, and the ills that you complain of, would be better preserved and cured by quiet than war? That peace has its honours and splendours, of a less perilous kind, not to mention the numerous other blessings that one might dilate on, with the not less numerous miseries of war? These considerations should teach you not to disregard my words, but rather to look in them every one for his own safety. If there be any here who feels certain either by right or might to effect his object, let not this surprise be to him too severe a disappointment. Let him remember that many before now have tried to chastise a wrongdoer, and failing to punish their enemy have not even saved themselves, while many who have trusted in force to gain an advantage, instead of gaining anything more, have been doomed to lose what they had. Vengeance is not necessarily successful because wrong has been done, or strength sure because it is confident, but the incalculable element in the future exercises the widest influence, and is the most treacherous, and yet in fact the most useful of all things, as it frightens us all equally, and thus makes us consider before attacking each other. Let us therefore now allow the undefined fear of this unknown future, and the immediate terror of the Athenians' presence to produce their natural impression, and let us consider any failure to carry out the programs that we may each have sketched out for ourselves as sufficiently accounted for by these obstacles, and send away the intruder from the country. And if everlasting peace be impossible between us, let us at all events make a treaty for as long a term as possible, and put off our private differences to another day. In fine, let us recognize that the adoption of my advice will leave us each citizens of a free state, and as such arbiters of our own destiny, able to return good or bad offices with equal effect, while its rejection will make us dependent on others, and thus not only impotent to repel an insult, but on the most favourable supposition, friends to our direst enemies, and at feud with our natural friends. For myself, though as I said at first, the representative of a great city, and able to think less of defending myself than of attacking others, I am prepared to concede something in prevision of these dangers. I am not inclined to ruin myself for the sake of hurting my enemies, or so blinded by animosity as to think myself equally master of my own plans, and of fortune which I cannot command. But I am ready to give up anything in reason. I call upon the rest of you to imitate my conduct of your own free will, without being forced to do so by the enemy. There is no disgrace in connections giving way to one another, a Dorian to a Dorian, or a Chalcidian to his brethren. Above and beyond this we are neighbours, live in the same country, are girt by the same sea, and go by the same name of Sicilians. We shall go to war again, I suppose, when the time comes, and again make peace among ourselves by means of future congresses. But the foreign invader, if we are wise, will always find us united against him, since the hurt of one is in danger of all, and we shall never in future invite into the island either allies or mediators. By so acting we shall at the present moment do for Sicily a double service, ridding her at once of the Athenians and of civil war, and in future shall live in freedom at home and be less menaced from abroad. Such were the words of Hermocrates. The Sicilians took his advice, and came to an understanding among themselves to end the war, each keeping what they had, the Camarinians taking Morgantina at a price fixed to be paid to the Syracusans, and the allies of the Athenians called the officers in command, and told them that they were going to make peace, and that they would be included in the treaty. The generals assenting, the peace was concluded, and the Athenian fleet afterwards sailed away from Sicily. Upon their arrival at Athens, the Athenians banished Pythodorus and Sophocles, and fined Eurymedon for having taken bribes to depart when they might have subdued Sicily. So thoroughly had the present prosperity persuaded the citizens that nothing could withstand them, and that they could achieve what was possible and impracticable alike, with means ample or inadequate it mattered not. The secret of this was their general extraordinary success, which made them confuse their strength with their hopes. The same summer the Megarians in the city, pressed by the hostilities of the Athenians who invaded their country twice every year with all their forces, and harassed by the incursions of their own exiles at Pegae, who had been expelled in a revolution by the popular party, began to ask each other whether it would not be better to receive back their exiles and free the town from one of its two scourges. The friends of the emigrants, perceiving the agitation, now more openly than before demanded the adoption of this proposition, and the leaders of the commons, seeing that the sufferings of the times had tired out the constancy of their supporters, entered in their alarm into correspondence with the Athenian generals, Hippocrates, son of Ariphon, and Demosthenes son of Alcisthenes, and resolved to betray the town, thinking this less dangerous to themselves than the return of the party which they had banished. It was accordingly arranged that the Athenians should first take the long walls extending for nearly a mile from the city to the port of Nicaea, to prevent the Peloponnesians coming to the rescue from that place, where they formed the sole garrison to secure the fidelity of Megara, and that after this the attempt should be made to put into their hands the upper town, which it was thought would come over with less difficulty. The Athenians, after plans had been arranged between themselves in their correspondence both as to words and actions, sailed by night to Minoa, the island off Megara, with 600 heavy infantry under the command of Hippocrates, and took post in a quarry not far off, out of which bricks used to be taken for the walls, while Demosthenes, the other commander, with a detachment of Plataean light troops and another of Peripoli, placed himself in ambush in the precinct of Enyalius, which was still nearer. No one knew of it except those whose business it was to know that night. A little before daybreak, the traders in Megara began to act. Every night for a long time back, under pretense of marauding, in order to have a means of opening the gates, they had been used, with the consent of the officer in command, to carry by night a sculling boat upon a cart along the ditch to the sea, and so to sail out, bringing it back again before day upon the cart, and taking it within the wall through the gates, in order, as they pretended, to baffle the Athenian blockade at Minoa, there being no boat to be seen in the harbour. On the present occasion the cart was already at the gates, which had been opened in the usual way for the boat, when the Athenians, with whom this had been concerted, saw it, and ran at the top of their speed from the ambush, in order to reach the gates before they were shut again, and while the cart was still there to prevent their being closed, their Megarian accomplices at the same moment killing the guard at the gates. The first to run in was Demosthenes with his Plataeans and Peripoli, just where the trophy now stands, and he was no sooner within the gates than the Plataeans engaged and defeated the nearest party of Peloponnesians, who had taken the alarm and came to the rescue, and secured the gates for the approaching Athenian heavy infantry. After this, each of the Athenians, as fast as they entered, went against the wall. A few of the Peloponnesian garrison stood their ground at first, and tried to repel the assault, and some of them were killed, but the main body took fright and fled, the night attack and the sight of the Megarian traitors in arms against them, making them think that all Megara had gone over to the enemy. It so happened also that the Athenian herald of his own idea called out and invited any of the Megarians that wished to join the Athenian ranks, and this was no sooner heard by the garrison than they gave way, and, convinced that they were victims of a concerted attack, took refuge in Nicaea. By daybreak, the walls being now taken, and the Megarians in the city in great agitation, the persons who had negotiated with the Athenians, supported by the rest of the popular party which was privy to the plot, said that they ought to open the gates and march out to battle. It had been concerted between them that the Athenians should rush in the moment that the gates were opened, while the conspirators were to be distinguished from the rest by being anointed with oil, and so to avoid being hurt. They could open the gates with more security, as 4,000 Athenian heavy infantry from Eleusis and 600 horse had marched all night, according to agreement, and were now close at hand. The conspirators were already anointed and at their posts by the gates, when one of their accomplices denounced the plot to the opposite party, who gathered together and came in a body, and roundly said that they must not march out, a thing they had never yet ventured on, even when in greater force than at present, or wantonly compromise the safety of the town, and that if what they said was not attended to, the battle would have to be fought in Megara. For the rest, they gave no sign of their knowledge of the intrigue, but stoutly maintained that their advice was the best, and meanwhile kept close by and watched the gates, making it impossible for the conspirators to effect their purpose. The Athenian generals, seeing that some obstacle had arisen and that the capture of the town by force was no longer practicable, at once proceeded to invest Nicaea, thinking that, if they could take it before relief arrived, the surrender of Megara would soon follow. Iron and stonemasons and everything else required quickly coming up from Athens, the Athenians started from the wall which they occupied, and from this point built a cross-wall looking towards Megara down to the sea on either side of Nicaea, the ditch and the walls being divided among the army, stones and bricks taken from the suburb, and the fruit trees and timber cut down to make a palisade wherever this seemed necessary, the houses also in the suburb with the addition of battlements sometimes entering into the fortification. The whole of this day the work continued, and by the afternoon of the next the wall was all but completed, when the garrison in Nicaea, alarmed by the absolute want of provisions, which they used to take in from the day from the upper town, not anticipating any speedy relief from the Peloponnesians, and supposing Megara to be hostile, capitulated to the Athenians on condition that they should give up their arms, and should each be ransomed for a stipulated sum. Their Lacedaemonian commander and any of any others of his countrymen in the place being left to the discretion of the Athenians. On these conditions they surrendered and came out, and the Athenians broke down the long walls at their point of junction with Megara, took possession of Nicaea, and went on with their other preparations. Just at this time, the Lacedaemonian Brasidas, son of Tellus, happened to be in the neighbourhood of Sicyon and Corinth, getting ready an army for Thrace. As soon as he heard of the capture of the walls, fearing for the Peloponnesians in Nicaea and the safety of Megara, he sent to the Boeotians to meet him as quickly as possible at Tripodiscus, a village so called of the Megarid, under Mount Geranea, and went himself with 2,700 Corinthian heavy infantry, 400 Phliasians, 600 Sicyonians, and such troops of his own as he had already levied, expecting to find Nicaea not yet taken. Hearing of its fall, he had marched out by night to Tripodiscus. He took 300 picked men from the army without waiting till his coming should be known, and came up to Megara unobserved by the Athenians, who were down by the sea, ostensibly and really if possible to attempt Nicaea, but above all to get into Megara and secure the town. He accordingly invited the townspeople to admit his party, saying that he had hopes of recovering Nicaea. However, one of the Megarian factions feared that he might expel them and restore the exiles, the other that the commons, apprehensive of this very danger, might set upon them, and the city be thus destroyed by a battle within its gates under the eyes of the ambushed Athenians. He was accordingly refused admittance, both parties electing to remain quiet and await the event, each expecting a battle between the Athenians and the relieving army, and thinking it safer to see their friends victorious before declaring in their favour. Unable to carry his point, Brasidas went back to the rest of the army. At daybreak the Boeotians joined him. Having determined to relieve Megara, whose danger they considered their own, even before hearing from Brasidas, they were already in full force at Plataea, when his messenger arrived to add spurs to their resolution, and they at once sent on to him 2,200 heavy infantry and 600 horse, returning home with the main body. The whole army thus assembled numbered 6,000 heavy infantry. The Athenian heavy infantry were drawn up by Nicaea and the sea, but the light troops being scattered over the plain were attacked by the Boeotian horse and driven to the sea, being taken entirely by surprise, as on previous occasions no relief had ever come to the Megarians from any quarter. Here the Boeotians were in their turn charged and engaged by the Athenian horse, and a cavalry action ensued which lasted a long time, and in which both parties claimed the victory. The Athenians killed and stripped the leader of the Boeotian horse and some few of his comrades who had charged right up to Nicaea, and remaining masters of the bodies gave them back under truce and set up a trophy. But regarding the action as a whole, the forces separated without either side having gained a decisive advantage, the Boeotians returning to their army and the Athenians to Nicaea. After this, Brasidas and the army came nearer to the sea and to Megara, and taking up a convenient position, remained quiet in order of battle, expecting to be attacked by the Athenians, and knowing that the Megarians were waiting to see which would be the victor. This attitude seemed to present two advantages. Without taking the offensive, or willingly provoking the hazards of a battle, they openly showed their readiness to fight, and thus without bearing the burden of the day would fairly reap its honours, while at the same time they effectually served their interests at Megara. For if they had failed to show themselves they would not have had a chance, but would have certainly been considered vanquished, and have lost the town. As it was, the Athenians might possibly not be inclined to accept their challenge, and their object would be attained without fighting. And so it turned out. The Athenians formed outside the long walls, and the enemy not attacking, there remained motionless, their generals having decided that the risk was too unequal. In fact, most of their objects had already been attained, and they would have to begin a battle against superior numbers, and if victorious could only gain Megara, while a defeat would destroy the flower of their heavy soldiery. For the enemy it was different, as even the states actually represented in his army risked each only a part of its entire force. He might well be more audacious. Accordingly, after waiting for some time without either side attacking, the Athenians withdrew to Nicaea, and the Peloponnesians after them to the point from which they had set out. The friends of the Megarian exiles now threw aside their hesitation, and opened the gates to Brasidas, and the commanders from the different states, looking upon him as the victor, and upon the Athenians as having declined the battle, and receiving them into the town, proceeded to discuss matters with them, the party in correspondence with the Athenians being paralyzed by the turn things had taken. Afterwards, Brasidas let the allies go home, and himself went back to Corinth to prepare for his expedition to Thrace, his original destination. The Athenians also returned home, the Megarians in the city most implicated in the Athenian negotiation, knowing that they had been detected, presently disappeared, while the rest conferred with the friends of the exiles, and restored the party at Pegae, after binding them under solemn oaths to take no vengeance for the past, and only to consult the real interests of the town. However, as soon as they were in office, they held a review of the heavy infantry, and separating the battalions, picked out about 100 of their enemies, and of those who were thought to be the most involved in the correspondence with the Athenians, brought them before the people, and compelling the vote to be given openly, had them condemned and executed, and established a close oligarchy in the town, a revolution which lasted a very long while, although affected by a very few partisans. This is the end of Book 4, Chapter 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Peloponnesian War, by Thucydides, translated by Richard Crawley. Book 4, Chapter 14. The same summer the Mytileneans were about to fortify Antandrus, as they had intended, when Demodocus and Aristides, the commanders of the Athenian squadron engaged in levying subsidies, heard on the Hellespont of what was being done to the place, Lamachus their colleague having sailed with 10 ships into the Pontus, and conceived fears of its becoming a second Anaia, the place in which the Samian exiles had established themselves to annoy Samos, helping the Peloponnesians by sending pilots to their navy, and keeping the city in agitation and receiving all its outlaws. They accordingly got together a force from the allies and set sail, defeated in battle the troops that met them from Antandrus, and retook the place. Not long after, Lamachus, who had sailed into the Pontus, lost his ships at anchor in the river Calex, in the territory of Heraclea, rain having fallen in the interior, and the flood coming suddenly down upon them, and himself and his troops passed by land through the Bithynian Thracians on the Asiatic side, and arrived at Chalcedon, the Megarian colony at the mouth of the Pontus. The same summer the Athenian general Demosthenes arrived at Naupactus with 40 ships immediately after the return from the Megarid. Hippocrates and himself had overtures made to them by certain men in the cities in Boeotia, who wished to change the constitution and introduce a democracy as at Athens. Theodorus, a Theban exile, being the chief mover in this intrigue. The seaport town of Siphae in the Bay of Chrysae, in the Thespian territory, was to be betrayed to them by one party. Chaeronea, a dependency of what was formerly called the Minyan, now the Boeotian Orchomenos, to be put into their hands by another from that town, whose exiles were very active in the business, hiring men in Peloponnese. Some Phocians also were in the plot, Chaeronea being the frontier town of Boeotia and close to Phanotis in Phocia. Meanwhile, the Athenians were to seize Delium, the sanctuary of Apollo, in the territory of Tanagra, looking towards Euboea, and all these events were to take place simultaneously upon a day appointed, in order that the Boeotians might be unable to unite to oppose them at Delium, being everywhere detained by disturbances at home. Should the enterprise succeed and Delium be fortified, its authors confidently expected that even if no revolution should immediately follow in Boeotia, yet with these places in their hands, and the country being harassed by incursions, and a refuge in each instance near for the partisans engaged in them, things would not remain as they were, but that the rebels being supported by the Athenians and the forces of the oligarchs divided, it would be possible after a while to settle matters according to their wishes. Such was the plot in contemplation. Hippocrates with a force raised at home awaited the proper moment to take the field against the Boeotians, while he sent on Demosthenes with the 40 ships above mentioned to Naupactus, to raise in those parts an army of Acarnanians, and of the other allies, and sail and receive Siphae from the conspirators, a day having been agreed on for the simultaneous execution of both these operations. Demosthenes on his arrival found Oeniadae already compelled by the united Acarnanians to join the Athenian confederacy, and himself raising all the allies in those countries, marched against and subdued Salynthius and the Agrians, after which he devoted himself to the preparations necessary to enable him to be at Siphae by the time appointed. About the same time in the summer, Brasidas set out for his march for the Thracian places, with 1,700 heavy infantry, and arriving at Heraclea and Trachis, from thence sent on a messenger to his friends at Pharsalus, to ask them to conduct himself and his army through the country. Accordingly there came to Militia in Achaia Paneras, Dorus, Hippolochidas, Torylaeus, and Strophacus, the Chalcidian Proxenus, under whose escort he resumed his march, being accompanied also by other Thessalians, among whom was Niconidas of Larissa, a friend of Perdiccas. It was never very easy to traverse Thessaly without an escort, and throughout all Hellas for an armed force to pass without leave through a neighbour's country was a delicate step to take. Besides this, the Thessalian people had always sympathized with the Athenians. Indeed, if instead of the customary close oligarchy there had been a constitutional government in Thessaly, he would never have been able to proceed, since even as it was he was met on his march at the river Enipeus by certain of the opposite party, who forbade his further progress, and complained of his making the attempt without the consent of the nation. To this his escort answered that they had no intention of taking him through against their will. They were only friends in attendance on an unexpected visitor. Brasidas himself added that he came as a friend to Thessaly and its inhabitants, his arms not being directed against them but against the Athenians, with whom he was at war, and that although he knew of no quarrel between the Thessalians and Lacedaemonians to prevent the two nations having access to each other's territory, he neither would nor could proceed against their wishes. He could only beg them not to stop him. With this answer they went away, and he took the advice of his escort and pushed on without halting, before a greater force might gather to prevent him. Thus, in the day that he set out from Melitia, he performed the whole distance to the Pharsalus, and encamped on the river Apidanus, and so to Phacium, and from thence to Peribea. Here his Thessalian escort went back, and the Peribaeans, who are subjects of Thessaly, sent him down at Delium in the dominions of Perdiccas, a Macedonian town under Mount Olympus, looking toward Thessaly. In this way Brasidas hurried through Thessaly before anyone could be got ready to stop him, and reached Perdiccas in Chalcidice. The departure of the army from Peloponnese had been procured by the Thracian towns in revolt against Athens, and by Perdiccas, alarmed at the successes of the Athenians. The Chalcidians thought that they would be the first objects of an Athenian expedition, not that the neighbouring towns which had not yet revolted did not also secretly join in the invitation. And Perdiccas also had his apprehensions on account of his old quarrels with the Athenians, although not openly at war with them, and above all wished to reduce Arrhabaeus, king of the Lyncestians. It had been less difficult for them to get an army to leave Peloponnese because of the ill fortune of the Lacedaemonians at the present moment. The attacks of the Athenians upon Peloponnese, and in particular upon Laconia, might, it was hoped, be diverted most effectually by sending them in return, and by sending an army to their allies, especially as they were willing to maintain it, and asked for it to aid them in revolting. The Lacedaemonians were also glad to have an excuse for sending some of the Helots out of the country, for fear that the present aspect of affairs and the occupation of Pylos might encourage them to move. Indeed, fear of their numbers and obstinacy even persuaded the Lacedaemonians to the action which I shall now relate, their policy at all times having been governed by the necessity of taking precautions against them. The Helots were invited by a proclamation to pick out those of their number who claimed to have most distinguished themselves against the enemy, in order that they might receive their freedom, the object being to test them, as it was thought that the first to claim their freedom would be the most high-spirited and the most apt to rebel. As many as 2,000 were selected accordingly, who crowned themselves and went round the temples rejoicing in their new freedom. The Spartans soon afterwards did away with them, however, and no one ever knew how each of them perished. The Spartans now therefore gladly sent 700 as heavy infantry with Brasidas, who recruited the rest of his force by means of money in Peloponnese. Brasidas himself was sent out by the Lacedaemonians mainly at his own desire, although the Chalcidians also were eager to have a man so thorough as he had shown himself whenever there was anything to be done at Sparta, and whose after-service abroad proved of the utmost use to his country. At the present moment, his just and moderate conduct toward the towns generally succeeded in procuring their revolt, besides the places which he managed to take by treachery, and thus when the Lacedaemonians desired to treat, as they ultimately did, they had places to offer in exchange, and the burden of war meanwhile shifted from Peloponnese. Later in the war, after the events in Sicily, the present valour and conduct of Brasidas, known by experience to some, by hearsay to others, was what mainly created in the allies of Athens a feeling for the Lacedaemonians. He was the first who went out and showed himself so good a man at all points, as to leave behind him the conviction that the rest were like him. Meanwhile, his arrival in the Thracian country no sooner became known to the Athenians than they declared war against Perdiccas, whom they regarded as the author of the expedition, and kept a closer watch on their allies in that quarter. Upon the arrival of Brasidas and his army, Perdiccas immediately started with them and with his own forces against Arrhabaeus, son of Bromerus, king of the Lyncestian Macedonians, his neighbour, with whom he had a quarrel and whom he wished to subdue. However, when he arrived with his army and Brasidas at the pass leading into Lyncus, Brasidas told him that before commencing hostilities he wished to go and try to persuade Arrhabaeus to become the ally of Lacedaemon, this latter having already made overtures intimating his willingness to make Brasidas arbitrator between them, and the Chalcidian envoys accompanying him, having warned him not to remove the apprehensions of Perdiccas, in order to ensure his greater zeal in their cause. Besides, the envoys of Perdiccas had talked at Lacedaemon about his bringing many of the places round him into alliance with them, and thus Brasidas thought he might take a larger view of the question of Arrhabaeus. Perdiccas, however, retorted that he had not brought him with him to arbitrate in their quarrel, but to put down the enemies whom he might point out to him, and that while he, Perdiccas, maintained half his army, it was a breach of faith for Brasidas to parley with Arrhabaeus. Nevertheless, Brasidas disregarded the wishes of Perdiccas and held the parley in spite of him, and suffered himself to be persuaded to lead off the army without invading the country of Arrhabaeus, after which Perdiccas, holding that faith had not been kept with him, contributed only a third instead of half of the support of the army. The same summer, without loss of time, Brasidas marched with the Chalcidians against Acanthus, a colony of the Andrians, a little before vintage. The inhabitants were divided into two parties on the question of receiving him, those who had joined the Chalcidians in inviting him, and the popular party. However, fear for their fruit, which was still out, enabled Brasidas to persuade the multitude to admit him alone, and to hear what he had to say before making a decision, and he was admitted accordingly, and appeared before the people, and not being a bad speaker for a Lacedaemonian, addressed them as follows. Acanthians, the Lacedaemonians have sent out me and my army to make good the reason that we gave for the war when we began it, viz., that we were going to war with the Athenians in order to free Hellas. Our delay in coming has been caused by mistaken expectation as to the war at home, which led us to hope, by our own unassisted efforts and without your risking anything, to effect the speedy downfall of the Athenians, and you must not blame us for this, as we are now come to the moment that we were able, prepared with your aid to do your best to subdue them. Meanwhile, I am astonished at finding your gates shut against me, and at not meeting with a better welcome. We Lacedaemonians thought of you as allies eager to have us, to whom we should come in spirit even before we were with you in body, and in this expectation undertook all the risks of a march of many days through a strange country, so far did our zeal carry us. It will be a terrible thing if after this you have other intentions, and mean to stand in the way of your own and Hellenic freedom. It is not merely that you oppose me yourselves, but wherever I may go people will be less inclined to join me, on the score that you, to whom I first came, an important town like Acanthus, and prudent men like the Acanthians, refuse to admit me. I shall have nothing to prove that the reason which I advance is the true one. It will be said either that there is something unfair in the freedom which I offer, or that I am in insufficient force and unable to protect you against an attack from Athens. Yet when I went with the army which I now have to the relief of Nicaea, the Athenians did not venture to engage me, although in greater force than I, and it is not likely they will ever send across sea against you an army as numerous as they had at Nicaea. And for myself, I have come here not to hurt but to free the Hellenes. Witness the solemn oaths by which I have bound my government that the allies that I may bring over shall be independent. And besides, my object in coming is not by force or fraud to obtain your alliance, but to offer you mine, to help you against your Athenian masters. I protest, therefore, against any suspicions of my intentions after the guarantees which I offer, and equally so against doubts of my ability to protect you, and I invite you to join me without hesitation. Some of you may hang back because they have private enemies, and fear that I may put the city in the hands of a party. None need be more tranquil than they. I am not come here to help this party or that, and I do not consider that I should be bringing you freedom in any real sense, if I should disregard your constitution, and enslave the many to the few, or the few to the many. This would be heavier than a foreign yoke, and we Lacedaemonians, instead of being thanked for our pain, should get neither honour nor glory, but contrariwise reproaches. The charges which strengthen our hands in the war against the Athenians would on our own showing be merited by ourselves, and more hateful in us than in those who make no pretensions to honesty, as it is more disgraceful for persons of character to take what they covet by fair-seeming fraud than by open force, the one aggression having for its justification the might which fortune gives, the other being simply a piece of clever roguery. A matter which concerns us thus nearly we naturally look to most jealously, and over and above the oaths that I have mentioned, what stronger assurance can you have, when you see that our words, compared with the actual facts, produce the necessary conviction that it is our interest to act as we say? If to these considerations of mine you put in the plea of inability, and claim that your friendly feelings should save you from being hurt by your refusal, if you say that freedom, in your opinion, is not without its dangers, and that it is right to offer it to those who can accept it, but not to force it on any against their will, then I shall take the gods and heroes of your country to witness that I came for your good and was rejected, and shall do my best to compel you by laying waste your land. I shall do so without scruple, being justified by the necessity which constrains me, first, to prevent the Lacedaemonians from being damaged by you their friends, in the event of your non-adhesion, through the moneys that you pay to the Athenians, and secondly, to prevent the Hellenes from being hindered by you in shaking off their servitude. Otherwise, indeed, we should have no right to act as we propose, except in the name of some public interest. What call should we Lacedaemonians have to free those who do not wish it? Empire we do not aspire to. It is what we are laboring to put down, and we should wrong the greater number if we allowed you to stand in the way of the independence that we offer to all. Endeavour, therefore, to decide wisely, and strive to begin the work of liberation for the Hellenes, and lay up for yourselves endless renown, while you escape private loss, and cover your commonwealth with glory. Such were the words of Brasidas. The Acanthians, after much had been said on both sides of the question, gave their votes in secret, and the majority, influenced by the seductive arguments of Brasidas and by fear for their fruit, decided to revolt from Athens, not however admitting the army until they had taken his personal security for the oaths sworn by his government before they sent him out, assuring the independence of the allies whom he might bring over. Not long after, Stagirus, a colony of the Andrians, followed their example and revolted. Such were the events of this summer. It was in the first days of the winter following that the places in Boeotia were to be put in the hands of the Athenian generals, Hippocrates and Demosthenes, the latter of whom was to go with his ships to Siphae, the former to Delium. A mistake, however, was made in the days on which they were to start, and Demosthenes, sailing first to Siphae, with the Acarnanians and many of the allies from those parts on board, failed to effect anything through the plot having been betrayed by Nicomachus, a Phocian from Phanotis, who told the Lacedaemonians, and they the Boeotians. Succours accordingly flocked in from all parts of Boeotia, Hippocrates not being yet there to make his diversion, and Siphae and Chaeronea were promptly secured, and the conspirators, informed of the mistake, did not venture on any movement in the towns. Meanwhile, Hippocrates made a levy in mass of the citizens, resident aliens, and foreigners in Athens, and arrived at his destination after the Boeotians had already come back from Siphae, and encamping his army began to fortify Delium, the sanctuary of Apollo, in the following manner. A trench was dug all round the temple and the consecrated ground, and the earth thrown up from the excavation was made to do duty as a wall, in which stakes were also planted, the vines round the sanctuary being cut down and thrown in, together with stones and bricks pulled down from the houses near, every means, in short, being used to run up the rampart. Wooden towers were also erected where they were wanted, and where there was no part of the temple buildings left standing, as on the side where the gallery once existing had fallen in. The work was begun on the third day after leaving home, and continued during the fourth, until dinner-time on the fifth, when most of it being now finished, the army removed from Delium about 1.25 miles on its way home. From this point most of the light troops went straight on, while the heavy infantry halted and remained where they were, Hippocrates having stayed behind at Delium to arrange the posts, and to give directions for the completion of such part of the outworks as had been left unfinished. During the days thus employed the Boeotians were mustering at Tanagra, and by the time that they had come in from all the towns, found the Athenians already on their way home. The rest of the 11 Boeotarchs were against giving battle, as the enemy was no longer in Boeotia, the Athenians being just over the Oropian border, when they halted, but Pagonandas, son of Aeolidas, one of the Boeotarchs of Thebes, Arianthides, son of Lysimachus, being the other, and then commander-in-chief, thought it best to hazard a battle. He accordingly called the men to him, company after company, to prevent their all leaving their arms at once, and urged them to attack the Athenians and stand the issue of a battle, speaking as follows: Boeotians, the idea that we ought not to give battle to the Athenians unless we came up with them in Boeotia is one which should never have entered into the heads of any of us, your generals. It was to annoy Boeotia that they crossed the frontier and built a fort in our country, and they are therefore, I imagine, our enemies wherever we may come up with them, and from wheresoever they may have come to act as enemies do. And if anyone has taken up with the idea in question for reasons of safety, it is high time for him to change his mind. The party attacked, whose own country is in danger, can scarcely discuss what is prudent with the calmness of men who are in full enjoyment of what they have got, and are thinking of attacking a neighbour in order to get more. It is your national habit, in your country or out of it, to oppose the same resistance to a foreign invader, and when that invader is Athenian and lives upon your frontier besides, it is doubly imperative to do so. As between neighbours generally, freedom means simply a determination to hold one's own, and with neighbours like these who are trying to enslave near and far alike, there is nothing for it but to fight it out to the last. Look at the condition of the Euboeans and most of the rest of Hellas, and be convinced that others have to fight with their neighbours for this frontier or that, but that for us conquest means one frontier for the whole country, about which no dispute can be made, for they will simply come and take by force what we have. So much more have we to fear from this neighbour than from another. Besides, people who, like the Athenians in the present instance, are tempted by pride of strength to attack their neighbours, usually march most confidently against those who keep still, and only defend themselves in their own country, but think twice before they grapple with those who meet them outside their frontier, and strike the first blow if opportunity offers. The Athenians have shown us this themselves. The defeat which we inflicted upon them at Coronea, at the time when our quarrels had allowed them to occupy the country, has given great security to Boeotia until the present day. Remembering this, the old must equal their ancient exploits, and the young, the sons of the heroes of that time, must endeavour not to disgrace their native valour, and trusting in the help of the god whose temple has been sacrilegiously fortified, and in the victims which in our sacrifices have proved propitious, we must march against the enemy, and teach him that he must go and get what he wants by attacking someone who will not resist him, but that men whose glory it is to be always ready to give battle for the liberty of their own country, and never unjustly to enslave that of others, will not let him go without a struggle. By these arguments, Pagondas persuaded the Boeotians to attack the Athenians, and quickly breaking up his camp, led his army forward, it being now late in the day. On nearing the enemy, he halted in a position where a hill intervening prevented the two armies from seeing each other, and then formed and prepared for action. Meanwhile, Hippocrates at Delium, informed of the approach of the Boeotians, sent orders to his troops to throw themselves into line, and himself joined them not long afterwards, leaving about 300 horse behind him at Delium at once to guard the place in case of attack, and to watch their opportunity and fall upon the Boeotians during the battle. The Boeotians placed a detachment to deal with these, and when everything was arranged to their satisfaction appeared over the hill, and halted in the order which they had determined on, to the number of 7,000 heavy infantry, more than 10,000 light troops, 1,000 horse, and 500 targeteers. On their right were the Thebans and those of their province, in the centre the Haliartians, Coroneans, Copaeans, and the other people around the lake, and on the left the Thespians, Tanagrians, and Orchomenians, the cavalry and the light troops being at the extremity of each wing. The Thebans formed 25 shields deep, the rest as they pleased. Such was the strength and disposition of the Boeotian army. On the side of the Athenians, the heavy infantry throughout the whole army formed 8 deep, being in numbers equal to the enemy, with the cavalry upon the two wings. Light troops regularly armed there were none in the army, nor had there ever been any at Athens. Those who had joined in the invasion, though many times more numerous than those of the enemy, had mostly followed unarmed as part of the levy and mass of the citizens and foreigners at Athens, and having started first on their way home were not present in any number. The armies being now in line and upon the point of engaging, Hippocrates the general passed along the Athenian ranks and encouraged them as follows. Athenians, I shall only say a few words to you, but brave men require no more, and they are addressed more to your understanding than to your courage. None of you must fancy that we are going out of our way to run this risk in the country of another. Fought in their territory, the battle will be ours. If we conquer, the Peloponnesians will never invade your country without the Boeotian horse, and in one battle you will win Boeotia, and in a manner free Attica. Advance to meet them then like citizens of a country in which you all glory as the first in Hellas, and like sons of the fathers who beat them at Oinophyta with Myronides, and thus gained possession of Boeotia. Hippocrates had got halfway through the army with his exhortation, when the Boeotians, after a few more hasty words from Pagondas, struck up the Paean and came against them from the hill, the Athenians advancing to meet them and closing at a run. The extreme wing of neither army came into action, one like the other being stopped by the watercourses in the way, the rest engaged with the utmost obstinacy, shield against shield. The Boeotian left as far as the centre was worsted by the Athenians. The Thespians in that part of the field suffered most severely. The troops alongside them having given way, they were surrounded in a narrow space, and cut down fighting hand to hand. Some of the Athenians also fell into confusion in surrounding the enemy, and mistook and so killed each other. In this part of the field the Boeotians were beaten, and retreated upon the troops still fighting, but the right, where the Thebans were, got the better of the Athenians, and shoved them further and further back, though gradually at first. It so happened also that Pagondas, seeing the distress of his left, had sent 2 squadrons of horse where they could not be seen round the hill, and their sudden appearance struck a panic into the victorious wing of the Athenians, who thought that it was another army coming against them. At length, in both parts of the field, disturbed by this panic and with their line broken by the advancing Thebans, the whole Athenian army took to flight. Some made for Delium and the sea, some for Oropus, others for Mount Parnas, or wherever they had hopes of safety, pursued and cut down by the Boeotians, and in particular by the cavalry, comprised partly of Boeotians and partly of Locrians, who had come up just as the rout began. Night, however, coming on to interrupt the pursuit, the mass of the fugitives escaped more easily than they would otherwise have done. The next day the troops at Oropus and Delium returned home by sea, after leaving a garrison in the latter place, which they continued to hold, notwithstanding the defeat. The Boeotians set up a trophy, took up their own dead, and stripped those of the enemy, and leaving a guard over them, retired to Tanagra, there to take measures for attacking Delium. Meanwhile, a herald came from the Athenians to ask for the dead, but was met and turned back by a Boeotian herald, who told him that he would effect nothing until the return of himself the Boeotian herald, and who then went on to the Athenians, and told them on the part of the Boeotians that they had done wrong in transgressing the law of the Hellenes. Of what use was the universal custom protecting the temples in an invaded country, if the Athenians were to fortify Delium and live there, acting exactly as if they were on unconsecrated ground, and drawing and using for their purposes the water which they, the Boeotians, never touched except for sacred uses? Accordingly, for the god as well as for themselves, in the name of the deities concerned and of Apollo, the Boeotians invited them first to evacuate the temple, if they wished to take up the dead that belonged to them. After these words from the herald, the Athenians sent their own herald to the Boeotians to say that they had not done any wrong to the temple, and for the future would do it no more harm than they could help, not having occupied it originally in any such design, but to defend themselves from it against those who were really wronging them. The law of the Hellenes was that conquest of a country, whether more or less extensive, carried with it possession of the temples in that country, with the obligation to keep up the usual ceremonies, at least as far as possible. The Boeotians and most other people who had turned out the owners of a country and put themselves in their place by force, now held as of right the temples which they originally entered as usurpers. If the Athenians could have conquered more of Boeotia, this would have been the case with them. As things stood, the piece of it which they had got they should treat as their own, and not quit unless obliged. The water they had disturbed under the impulsion of a necessity which they had not wantonly incurred, having been forced to use it in defending themselves against the Boeotians who first invaded Attica. Besides, anything done under the pressure of war and danger might reasonably claim indulgence, even in the eyes of the god, or why, pray, were the altars the asylum for involuntary offences? Transgression also was a term applied to presumptuous offenders, not to the victims of adverse circumstances. In short, which were most impious, the Boeotians who wished to barter dead bodies for holy places, or the Athenians who refused to give up holy places to obtain what was theirs by right? The condition of evacuating Boeotia must therefore be withdrawn. They were no longer in Boeotia. They stood where they stood by the right of the sword. All that the Boeotians had to do was tell them to take up their dead under a truce according to the national custom. The Boeotians replied that if they were in Boeotia, they must evacuate that country before taking up their dead. If they were in their own country, they could do as they pleased, for they knew that, although the Oropid, where the bodies as it chanced were lying, the battle having been fought on the border, was subject to Athens, yet the Athenians could not get them without their leave. Besides, why should they grant a truce for Athenian ground? And what could be fairer than to tell them to evacuate Boeotia if they wished to get what they asked? The Athenian herald accordingly returned with this answer, without having accomplished his object. Meanwhile the Boeotians at once sent for darters and slingers from the Malian Gulf, and with 2,000 Corinthian heavy infantry who had joined them after the battle, the Peloponnesian garrison which had evacuated Nicaea, and some Megarians with them, marched against Delium, and attacked the fort, and after diverse efforts finally succeeded in taking it by an engine of the following description. They saw it in two and scooped out a great beam from end to end, and fitting it nicely together again like a pipe, hung by chains a cauldron at one extremity from which communicated an iron tube projecting from the beam, which was itself in great part plated with iron. This they brought up from a distance upon carts to the part of the wall principally composed of vines and timber, and when it was near, inserted huge bellows into their end of the beam and blew with them. The blast, passing closely confined into the cauldron, which was filled with lighted coals, sulphur, and pitch, made a great blaze, and set fire to the wall, which soon became untenable for its defenders, who left it and fled, and in this way the fort was taken. Of the garrison some were killed and 200 made prisoner, most of the rest got on board their ships and returned home. Soon after the fall of Delium, which took place 17 days after the battle, the Athenian herald, without knowing what had happened, came again for the dead, which were now restored by the Boeotians, who no longer answered as at first. Not quite 500 Boeotians fell in the battle, and nearly 1,000 Athenians, including Hippocrates the general, besides a great number of light troops and camp followers. Soon after this battle, Demosthenes, after the failure of his voyage to Siphae and of the plot on the town, availed himself of the Acarnanian and Megarian troops and of the 400 Athenian heavy infantry which he had on board, to make a descent on the Sicilian coast. Before, however, all his ships had come to shore, the Sicilians came up and routed and chased to their ships those that had landed, killing some and taking others prisoner, after which they set up a trophy, and gave back the dead under truce. About the same time with the affair of Delium took place the death of Sitalces, king of the Odrysians, who was defeated in battle in a campaign against the Triballi. Seuthes, son of Sparadicus, his nephew, succeeded to the kingdom of the Odrysians, and of the rest of Thrace ruled by Sitalces. The same winter Brasidas, with his allies in the Thracian places, marched against Amphipolis, the Athenian colony on the river Strymon. A settlement upon the spot on which the city now stands was before attempted by Aristagoras the Milesian when he fled from King Darius, who was, however, dislodged by the Edonians, and 32 years later by the Athenians, who sent thither 10,000 settlers of their own citizens, and whoever else chose to go. These were cut off at Drabescus by the Thracians. 29 years after, the Athenians returned, Hagnon, son of Nicias, being sent out as leader of the colony, and drove out the Edonians, and founded a town on the spot, formerly called Enia Hodoi, or 9 Ways. The base from which they started was Aeon, their commercial seaport at the mouth of the river, not more than 3 miles from the present town, which Hagnon named Amphipolis, because the Strymon flows round it on 2 sides, and he built it so as to be conspicuous from the sea and land alike, running a long wall across from river to river to complete the circumference. Brasidas now marched against this town, starting from Arne and Chalkidiki, arriving about dusk at Aulon and Bromiscus, where the lake of Bolbe runs into the sea. He supped there, and went on during the night. The weather was stormy, and it was snowing a little, which encouraged him to hurry on, in order, if possible, to take everyone at Amphipolis by surprise, except the party who were to betray it. The plot was carried on by some natives of Argilus, an Andrian colony, residing in Amphipolis, where they had also other accomplices gained over by Perdiccas or the Chalcidians. But the most active in the matter were the inhabitants of Argilus itself, which is close by, who had always been suspected by the Athenians, and had had designs on the place. These men now saw their opportunity arrive with Brasidas, and having for some time been in correspondence with their countrymen in Amphipolis for the betrayal of the town, at once received him into Argilus, and revolted from the Athenians, and that same night took him to the bridge over the river, where he found only a small guard to oppose him, the town being at some distance from the passage, and the walls not reaching down to it as at present. This guard he easily drove in, partly through there being treason in their ranks, partly from the stormy state of the weather and the suddenness of his attack, and so got across the bridge and immediately became master of all the property outside, the Amphipolitans having houses all over the quarter. The passage of Brasidas was a complete surprise to the people in the town, and the capture of many of those outside and the flight of the rest within the wall combined to produce great confusion among the citizens, especially as they did not trust one another. It is even said that if Brasidas, instead of stopping to pillage, had advanced straight against the town, he would probably have taken it. In fact, however, he established himself where he was, and overran the country outside, and for the present remained inactive, vainly awaiting a demonstration on the part of his friends within. Meanwhile, the party opposed to the traitors proved numerous enough to prevent their gates being immediately thrown open, and in concert with Eucles, the general who had come from Athens to defend the place, sent to the other commander in Thrace, Thucydides, son of Alorus, the author of this history, who was at the isle of Phasos, a Parian colony, half a day's sail from Amphipolis, to tell him to come to their relief. On receipt of this message, he at once set sail with 7 ships which he had with him in order, if possible, to reach Amphipolis in time to prevent its capitulation, or in any case to save Aeon. Meanwhile, Brasidas, afraid of succours arriving by sea from Thasos, and learning that Thucydides possessed the right of working the gold mines in that part of Thrace, and had thus great influence with the inhabitants of the continent, hastened to gain the town if possible before the people of Amphipolis should be encouraged by his arrival to hope that he could save them by getting together a force of allies from the sea and from Thrace, and so refused to surrender. He accordingly offered moderate terms, proclaiming that any of the Amphipolitans and Athenians who chose might continue to enjoy their property with full rights of citizenship, while those who did not wish to stay had 5 days to depart, taking their property with them. The bulk of the inhabitants upon hearing this began to change their minds, especially as only a small number of the citizens were Athenians, the majority having come from different quarters, and many of the prisoners outside had relations within the walls. They found the proclamation a fair one in comparison of what their fear had suggested, the Athenians being glad to go out, as they thought they ran more risk than the rest, and further did not expect any speedy relief, and the multitude generally being content at being left in possession of their civic rights, and at such an unexpected reprieve from danger. The partisans of Brasidas now openly advocated this course, seeing that the feeling of the people had changed, and that they no longer gave ear to the Athenian general present, and thus the surrender was made, and Brasidas was admitted by them on the terms of his proclamation. In this way they gave up the city, and late in the same day Thucydides and his ships entered the harbour of Eion, Brasidas having just got hold of Amphipolis, and having been within a night of taking Eion. Had the ships been less prompt in relieving it, in the morning it would have been his. After this, Thucydides put all in order at Eion to secure it against any present or future attack of Brasidas, and received such as had elected to come there from the interior according to the terms agreed on. Meanwhile, Brasidas suddenly sailed with a number of boats down the river to Eion, to see if he could not seize the point running out from the wall, and so command the entrance. At the same time he attempted it by land, but was beaten off on both sides, and had to content himself with arranging matters at Amphipolis and in the neighbourhood. Myrcinus, an Edonian town, also came over to him, the Edonian king Pittacus having been killed by the sons of Goaxus and his own wife Brauro, and Galepsus and Oisime, which are Thracian colonies, not long after followed its example. Perdiccas too came up immediately after the capture, and joined in these arrangements. The news that Amphipolis was in the hands of the enemy caused great alarm at Athens. Not only was the town valuable for the timber it afforded for shipbuilding and the money that it brought in, but also, although the escort of the Thessalians gave the Lacedaemonians a means of reaching the allies of Athens as far as the Strymon, yet as long as they were not masters of the bridge, but were watched on the side of Eion by the Athenian galleys, and on the land side impeded by a large and extensive lake formed by the waters of the river, it was impossible for them to go any further. Now, on the contrary, the path seemed open. There was also the fear of the allies revolting, owing to the moderation displayed by Brasidas in all his conduct, and to the declarations which he was everywhere making that he set out to free Hellas. The towns subject to the Athenians, hearing of the capture of Amphipolis, and of the terms accorded to it, and of the gentleness of Brasidas, felt most strongly encouraged to change their condition, and sent secret messages to him, begging him to come on to them, each wishing to be the first to revolt. Indeed, there seemed to be no danger in so doing. Their mistake in their estimate of the Athenian power was as great as that power afterwards turned out to be, and their judgment was based more on blind wishing than upon any sound prevision, for it is a habit of mankind to entrust to careless hope what they long for, and to use sovereign reason to thrust aside what they do not fancy. Besides, the late severe blow which the Athenians had met with in Boeotia, joined to the seductive, though untrue statements of Brasidas about the Athenians not having ventured to engage his single army at Nicaea, made the allies confident, and caused them to believe that no Athenian force would be sent against them. Above all, the wish to do what was agreeable at the moment, and the likelihood that they should find the Lacedaemonians full of zeal at starting, made them eager to venture. Observing this, the Athenians sent garrisons to the different towns, as far as was possible at such short notice and in winter, while Brasidas sent dispatches to Lacedaemon asking for reinforcements, and himself made preparations for building galleys in the Strymon. The Lacedaemonians, however, did not send him any, partly through envy on the part of their chief men, partly because they were more bent on recovering the prisoners of the island and ending the war. The same winter the Megarians took and razed to the foundations the long walls which had been occupied by the Athenians, and Brasidas, after the capture of Amphipolis, marched with his allies against Acte, a promontory running out from the king's dyke with an inward curve, and ending in Athos, a lofty mountain looking towards the Aegean Sea. In it are various towns, Sane, an Andrian colony close to the canal and facing the sea in the direction of Euboea, the others being Thyssus, Cleone, Acrothi, Olophyxus, and Delium, inhabited by mixed barbarian races speaking the two languages. There is also a small Chalcidian element, but the greater numbers are Tyrrheno-Pelasgians, once settled in Lemnos and Athens, and Bisaltians, Crestonians, and Edonians, the towns being all small ones. Most of these came over to Brasidas, but Sane and Delium held out and saw their land ravaged by him and his army. Upon their not submitting, he at once marched against Torone and Chalcidice, which was held by an Athenian garrison, having been invited by a few persons who were prepared to hand over the town. Arriving in the dark, a little before daybreak, he sat down with his army near the temple of the Dioscuri, rather more than a quarter of a mile from the city. The rest of the town of Torone and the Athenians in garrison did not perceive his approach, but his partisans, knowing that he was coming, a few of them had secretly gone out to meet him, were on the march for his arrival, and were no sooner aware of it than they took to them 7 light-armed men with daggers, who alone of 20 men ordered on this service dared to enter, commanded by Lyncestian, an Olynthian. These passed through the sea-wall, and without being seen went up and put to the sword the garrison of the highest post in the town, which stands on a hill, and broke open the postern on the side of Canestraeum. Brasidas, meanwhile, came a little nearer, and then halted with his main body, sending on 100 targeteers to be ready to rush in first the moment that a gate should be thrown open, and the beacon lighted as agreed. After some time passed in waiting and wondering at the delay, the targeteers by degrees got up close to the town. The Toronaeans, inside at work with the party that had entered, had by this time broken down the postern, and opened the gates leading to the marketplace by cutting through the bar, and first brought some men round, and let them in by the postern, in order to strike a panic into the surprised townsmen, by suddenly attacking them from behind and on both sides at once, after which they had raised the fire signal, as had been agreed, and took in by the market gates the rest of the targeteers. Brasidas, seeing the signal, told the troops to rise, and dashed forward amid the loud hurrahs of his men, which carried dismay among the astonished townspeople. Some burst in straight by the gate, others over some square pieces of timber placed against the wall, which had fallen down and was being rebuilt, to draw up stones. Brasidas and the greater number making straight uphill for the higher part of the town, in order to take it from top to bottom, and once for all, while the rest of the multitude spread in all directions. The capture of the town was effected before the great body of the Toronaeans had recovered from the surprise and confusion, but the conspirators and the citizens of their party at once joined the invaders. About 50 of the Athenian heavy infantry happened to be sleeping in the marketplace when the alarm reached them. A few of these were killed fighting, the rest escaped, some by land, others to the 2 ships on station, and took refuge in Acanthus, a fort garrisoned by their own men in the corner of the town, running out into the sea and cut off by a narrow isthmus, where they were joined by the Toronaeans of their party. Day now arrived, and the town being secured, Brasidas made a proclamation to the Toronaeans who had taken refuge with the Athenians to come out, as many as chose, to their homes without fearing for their rights or persons, and sent a herald to invite the Athenians to accept a truce, and to evacuate Lyncestis with their property, as being Chalcidian property. The Athenians refused this offer, but asked for a truce for a day to take up their dead. Brasidas granted it for 2 days, which he employed in fortifying the houses near, and the Athenians in doing the same to their positions. Meanwhile, he called a meeting of the Toronaeans, and said very much what he had said at Acanthus, namely that they must not look upon those who had negotiated with him for the capture of the town as bad men or as traitors, as they had not acted as they had done from corrupt motives, or in order to enslave the city, but for the good and freedom of Torone. Nor again must those who had not shared in the enterprise fancy that they would not equally reap its fruits, as he had not come to destroy either city or individual. This was the reason of his proclamation to those that had fled for refuge to the Athenians. He thought none the worse of them for their friendship for the Athenians. He believed that they had only to make trial of the Lacedaemonians, to like them as well, or even much better, as acting much more justly. It was for want of such a trial that they were now afraid of them. Meanwhile, he warned all of them to prepare to be staunch allies, and for being held responsible for all faults in future. For the past they had not wronged the Lacedaemonians, but had been wronged by others who were too strong for them, and any opposition that they might have offered him could be excused. Having encouraged them with this address, as soon as the truce expired he made his attack upon Lyncestis, the Athenians defending themselves from a poor wall and from some houses with parapets. One day they beat him off, the next the enemy were preparing to bring up an engine against them, from which they meant to throw fire upon the wooden defences, and the troops were already coming up to the point where they fancied they could best bring up the engine, and where place was most assailable. Meanwhile the Athenians put a wooden tower upon a house opposite, and carried up a quantity of jars and casks of water and big stones, and a large number of men also climbed up. The house thus laden too heavily suddenly broke down with a loud crash, at which the men who were near and saw it were more vexed than frightened, but those not so near, and still more those furthest off, thought that the place was already taken at that point, and fled in haste to the sea and the ships. Brasidas, perceiving that they were deserting the parapet, and seeing what was going on, dashed forward with his troops and immediately took the fort and put to the sword all whom he found in it. In this way the place was evacuated by the Athenians, who went across in their boats and ships to Pallene. Now there is a temple of Athena in Lyncestis, and Brasidas had proclaimed in the moment of making the assault that he would give 30 silver minae to the first on the wall. Being now of opinion that the capture was scarcely due to human means, he gave the 30 minae to the goddess for her temple, and razed and cleared Lyncestis, and made the whole of it consecrated ground. The rest of the winter he spent in settling the places in his hands, and in making designs upon the rest, and with the expiration of the winter the 8th year of this war ended. In the spring of the summer following, the Lacedaemonians and Athenians made an armistice for a year, the Athenians thinking that they would thus have full leisure to take their precautions before Brasidas could procure the revolt of any more of their towns, and might also, if it suited them, conclude a general peace. The Lacedaemonians divining the actual fears of the Athenians, and thinking that after tasting a respite from trouble and misery they would be more disposed to consent to a reconciliation, and to give back the prisoners, and make a treaty for the longer period. The great idea of the Lacedaemonians was to get their men back while Brasidas's good fortune lasted. Further successes might make the struggle a less unequal one in Chalcidice, but would leave them still deprived of their men, and even in Chalcidice not more than a match for the Athenians, and by no means certain of victory. An armistice was accordingly concluded by Lacedaemon and her allies upon the terms following. As to the temple and the oracle of the Pythian Apollo, we are agreed that whosoever will shall have access to it, without fraud or fear, according to the usages of his forefathers. The Lacedaemonians and the allies present agree to this, and promise to send heralds to the Boeotians and Phocaeans, and to do their best to persuade them to agree likewise. 2. As to the treasure of the god, we agree to exert ourselves to detect all malversators, truly and honestly following the customs of our forefathers, we and you and all others willing to do so, all following the customs of our forefathers. As to these points, the Lacedaemonians and the other allies are agreed, as has been said. 3. As to what follows, the Lacedaemonians and the other allies agree, if the Athenians conclude a treaty, to remain, each of us in our own territory, retaining our respective acquisitions. The garrison in Coryphasium keeping within Bufras and Tomaeus, that in Cythera attempting no communication with the Peloponnesian confederacy, neither we with them nor they with us. That in Nicaea and Minoa, not crossing the road leading from the gates of the temple of Nisus to that of Poseidon, and from thence straight to the bridge at Minoa, the Megarians and the allies being equally bound not to cross this road, and the Athenians retaining the island they have taken, without any communication on either side. As to Troezen, each side retaining what it has, and as was arranged with the Athenians. 4. As to the use of the sea, so far as refers to their own coast and to that of their confederacy, that the Lacedaemonians and their allies may voyage upon it any vessel rowed by oars, and of not more than 500 talents tonnage, not a vessel of war. 5. That all heralds and embassies, with as many attendants as they please for concluding the war and adjusting claims, shall have free passage, going and coming, to Peloponnese or Athens, by land and by sea. That during the truce, deserters whether bond or free shall be received neither by you nor by us. 7. Further, that satisfaction shall be given by you to us, and by us to you, according to the public law of our several countries, all disputes being settled by law without recourse to hostilities. The Lacedaemonians and allies agree to these articles, but if you have anything fairer or juster to suggest, come to Lacedaemon and let us know. Whatever shall be just will meet with no objection from either the Lacedaemonians or from the allies. Only let those who come with full powers, as you desire us. The truce shall be for 1 year. Approved by the people. The tribe of Achamantis had the prytany, Phoenippus was secretary, Nicaedes chairman. Laches moved, in the name of the good luck of the Athenians, that they should conclude the armistice upon the terms agreed upon by the Lacedaemonians and the allies. It was agreed accordingly in the popular assembly that the armistice should be for 1 year, beginning that very day, the 14th of the month of Elaphebolion, during which term ambassadors and heralds should go and come between the two countries, to discuss the bases of a pacification. That the generals and prytanes should call an assembly of the people, in which the Athenians should first consult on the peace, and on the mode in which the embassy for putting an end to the war should be admitted. that the embassy now present should at once take the engagement before the people to keep well and truly this truce for 1 year. On these terms the Lacedaemonians concluded with the Athenians and their allies on the 12th day of the Spartan month Gerastius, the allies also taking the oaths. Those who concluded and poured the libations were Taras, son of Ecatimides, Athenaeus, son of Pericleidas, and Philocaridas, son of Eryxidiades. Lacedaemonians: Aeneas, son of Octius, and Euphamidas, son of Aristonymus. Corinthians: Damotimus, son of Naucrates, and Onesimus, son of Megacles. Sicilians: Nicasus, son of Cecilus, and Menecrates, son of Amphidoros. Megarians: and Amphius, son of Eupidas, an Epidaurian, and the Athenian generals Nicostratus, son of Diotrephes, Nicias, son of Niceratus, and Autocles, son of Ptolemaeus. Such was the armistice, and during the whole of it conferences went on with the subject of a pacification. In the days in which they were going backwards and forwards to these conferences, Scione, a town in Pallene, revolted from Athens and went over to Brasidas. The Scionians say they are Pallenians from Peloponnese, and that their first founders on their voyage from Troy were carried into this spot by the storm which the Achaeans were caught in, and there settled. The Scionians had no sooner revolted than Brasidas crossed over by night to Scione, with a friendly galley ahead and himself in a small boat some way behind, his idea being that if he fell in with a vessel larger than the boat he would have the galley to defend him, while a ship that was a match for the galley would probably neglect the small vessel to attack the larger one, and thus leave him time to escape. His passage effected, he called a meeting of the Scionians, and spoke to the same effect as at Acanthus and Torone, adding that they merited the utmost commendation, in that, in spite of Pallene within the isthmus being cut off by the Athenian occupation of Potidea, and of their own practically insular position, they had of their own free will gone forward to meet their liberty, instead of timorously waiting until they had been, by force, compelled to their own manifest good. This was a sign that they would valiantly undergo any trial, however great, and if he should order affairs as he intended, he should count them among the truest and sincerest friends of the Lacedaemonians, and would in every other way honour them. The Scionians were elated by his language, and even those who had at first disapproved of what was being done, catching the general confidence, they determined on a vigorous conduct of the war, and welcomed Brasidas with all possible honours, publicly crowning him with the crown of gold as the liberator of Hellas, while private persons crowded round him and decked him with garlands as though he had been an athlete. Meanwhile Brasidas left them a small garrison for the present, and crossed back again, and not long afterwards sent over a larger force, intending with the help of the Scionians to attempt Mende and Potidea before the Athenians should arrive. Scione, he felt, being too like an island for them not to relieve it. He had besides intelligence in the above towns about their betrayal. In the midst of his designs upon the towns in question, a galley arrived with the commissioners carrying round the news of the armistice, Aristonymus for the Athenians and Athenaeus for the Lacedaemonians. The troops now crossed back to Torone, and the commissioners gave Brasidas notice of the convention. All the Lacedaemonian allies in Thrace accepted what had been done, and Aristonymus made no difficulty about the rest, but finding, on counting the days, that the Scionians had revolted after the date of the convention, refused to include them in it. To this Brasidas earnestly objected, asserting that the revolt took place before and would not give up the town. Upon Aristonymus reporting the case to Athens, the people at once prepared to send an expedition to Scione. Upon this, envoys arrived from Lacedaemon, alleging that this would be a breach of the truce, and laying claim to the town upon the faith of the assertion of Brasidas, and meanwhile offering to submit the question to arbitration. Arbitration, however, was what the Athenians did not choose to risk, being determined to send troops at once to the place, and furious at the idea of even the islanders now daring to revolt, in a vain reliance upon the power of the Lacedaemonians by land. Besides, the facts of the revolt were rather as the Athenians contended, the Scionians having revolted 2 days after the convention. Cleon accordingly succeeded in carrying a decree to reduce and put to death the Scionians, and the Athenians employed the leisure which they now enjoyed in preparing for the expedition. Meanwhile Mende revolted, a town in Pallene and a colony of the Eretrians, and was received without scruple by Brasidas, in spite of its having evidently come over during the armistice, on account of certain infringements of the truce alleged by him against the Athenians. This audacity of Mende was partly caused by seeing Brasidas forward in the matter, and by the conclusions drawn from his refusal to betray Scione, and besides, the conspirators in Mende were few, and, as I have already intimated, had carried on their practices too long not to fear detection for themselves, and not to wish to force the inclination of the multitude. This news made the Athenians more furious than ever, and they at once prepared against both towns. Brasidas, expecting their arrival, conveyed away to Olynthus in Chalcidice the women and children of the Scionians and Mendians, and sent over to them 500 Peloponnesian heavy infantry and 300 Chalcidian targeteers, all under the command of Polydamidas. Leaving these two towns to prepare together against the speedy arrival of the Athenians, Brasidas and Perdiccas started on a second joint expedition into Lyncus against Arrhabaeus, the latter with the forces of Macedonian subjects and a corps of heavy infantry composed of Hellenes domiciled in the country, the former with the Peloponnesians whom he still had with him, and the Chalcidians, Acanthians, and the rest in such force as they were able. In all there were about 3,000 Hellenic heavy infantry, accompanied by all the Macedonian cavalry with the Chalcidians, near 1,000 strong, besides an immense crowd of barbarians. On entering the country of Arrhabaeus, they found the Lyncestians encamped awaiting them, and themselves took up a position opposite. The infantry on either side were upon a hill with a plain between them, into which the horse of both armies first galloped down and engaged a cavalry action. After this the Lyncestian heavy infantry advanced from their hill to join their cavalry and offered battle, upon which Brasidas and Perdiccas also came down to meet them, and engaged and routed them with heavy loss, the survivors taking refuge upon the heights and there remaining inactive. The victors now set up a trophy, and waited 2 or 3 days for the Illyrian mercenaries who were to join Perdiccas. Perdiccas then wished to go on and attack the villages of Arrhabaeus, and to sit still no longer, but Brasidas, afraid that the Athenians might sail up during his absence, and of something happening to Mende, and seeing besides that the Illyrians did not appear, far from seconding this wish, was anxious to return. While they were thus disputing, the news arrived that the Illyrians had actually betrayed Perdiccas and had joined Arrhabaeus, and the fear inspired by their warlike character made both parties now think it best to retreat. However, owing to the dispute, nothing had been settled as to when they should start, and night coming on, the Macedonians and the barbarian crowd took fright in a moment in one of those mysterious panics to which great armies are liable, and persuaded that an army many times more numerous than that which had really arrived was advancing and all but upon them, suddenly broke and fled in the direction of home, and thus compelled Perdiccas, who at first did not perceive what had occurred, to depart without seeing Brasidas, the two armies being encamped at a considerable distance from each other. At daybreak, Brasidas, perceiving that the Macedonians had gone on, and that the Illyrians and Arrhabaeus were on the point of attacking him, formed his heavy infantry into a square, with the light troops in the centre, and himself also prepared to retreat. Posting his youngest soldiers to dash out wherever the enemy should attack them, he himself with 300 picked men in the rear intended to face about during the retreat and beat off the most forward of their assailants. Meanwhile, before the enemy approached, he sought to sustain the courage of his soldiers with the following hasty exhortation. Peloponnesians, if I did not suspect you of being dismayed at being left alone to sustain the attack of a numerous and barbarian enemy, I should just have said a few words to you as usual without further explanation. As it is, in the face of the desertation of our friends and the numbers of the enemy, I have some advice and information to offer, which, brief as they must be, will, I hope, suffice for the more important points. The bravery that you habitually display in war does not depend on your having allies at your side in this or that encounter, but on your native courage, nor have numbers any terrors for citizens of states like yours, in which the many do not rule the few, but rather the few the many, owing their position to nothing else than to superiority in the field. Inexperience now makes you afraid of barbarians, and yet the trial of strength which you had with the Macedonians among them, and my own judgment, confirmed by what I hear from others, should be enough to satisfy you that they will not prove formidable. Where an enemy seems strong but is really weak, a true knowledge of the facts makes his adversary the bolder, just as a serious antagonist is encountered most confidently by those who do not know him. Thus the present enemy might terrify an inexperienced imagination. They are formidable in outward bulk, their loud yelling is unbearable, and the brandishing of their weapons in the air has a threatening appearance. But when it comes to real fighting with an opponent who stands his ground, they are not what they have seemed. They have no regular order that they should be ashamed of deserting their positions when hard pressed. Flight and attack are with them equally honourable, and afford no test of courage. Their independent mode of fighting never leaving anyone who wants to run away without a fair excuse for so doing. In short, they think frightening you at a secure distance a surer game than meeting you hand to hand, otherwise they would have done the one and not the other. You can thus plainly see that the terrors with which they were at first invested are in fact trifling enough, though to the eye and ear very prominent. Stand your ground, therefore, when they advance, and again wait your opportunity to retire in good order, and you will reach a place of safety all the sooner, and will know forever afterwards that rabble such as these, to those who sustain their first attack, do but show off their courage by threats of the terrible things that they are going to do at a distance, but with those who give way to them are quick enough to display their heroism in pursuit when they can do so without danger. With this brief address, Brasidas began to lead off his army. Seeing this, the barbarians came on with much shouting and hubbub, thinking that he was flying, and that they would overtake him and cut him off. But wherever they charged, they found the young men ready to dash out against them, while Brasidas with his picked company sustained their onset. Thus the Peloponnesians withstood the first attack, to the surprise of the enemy, and afterwards received and repulsed them as fast as they came on, retiring as soon as their opponents became quiet. The main body of the barbarians ceased therefore to molest the Hellenes, with Brasidas in the open country, and leaving behind a certain number to harass their march, the rest went on after the flying Macedonians, slaying those with whom they came up, and so arrived in time to occupy the narrow pass between two hills that leads into the country of Arrhabaeus. They knew that this was the only way by which Brasidas could retreat, and now proceeded to surround him just as he entered the most impracticable part of the road, in order to cut him off. Brasidas, perceiving their intention, told his 300 to run on without order, each as quickly as he could to the hill which seemed easiest to take, and to try to dislodge the barbarians already there before they should be joined by the main body closing round him. These attacked and overpowered the party upon the hill, and the main army of the Hellenes now advanced with less difficulty toward it, the barbarians being terrified at seeing their men on that side, driven from the height, and no longer following the main body, who they considered had gained the frontier and made good their escape. The heights once gained, Brasidas now proceeded more securely, and the same day arrived in Arnissa, the first town in the dominions of Perdiccas. The soldiers, enraged at the desertion of the Macedonians, vented their rage on all their yokes of oxen which they found on the road, and on any baggage which had tumbled off, as might easily happen in the panic of a night retreat, by unyoking and cutting down the cattle and taking the baggage for themselves. From this moment Perdiccas began to regard Brasidas as an enemy, and to feel against the Peloponnesians a hatred which could not be congenial to the adversary of the Athenians. However, he departed from his natural interests, and made it his endeavour to come to terms with the latter, and to get rid of the former. On his return from Macedonia to Torone, Brasidas found the Athenians already masters of Mende, and remained quiet where he was, thinking it now out of his power to cross over into Pallene and assist the Mendaeans. But he kept good watch over Torone, for about the same time as the campaign in Lyncus, the Athenians sailed upon the expedition which we left them preparing against Mende and Scione, with 50 ships, 10 of which were Chians, 1,000 Athenian heavy infantry, and 600 archers, 100 Thracian mercenaries, and some targeteers drawn from their allies in the neighbourhood, under the command of Nicias, son of Niceratus, and Nicostratus, son of Diotrephes. Weighing from Potidæa, the fleet came to land opposite the temple of Poseidon, and proceeded against Mende, the men of which town reinforced by 300 Scionians with their Peloponnesian auxiliaries, 700 heavy infantry in all, under Polydamidas. They found encamped upon a strong hill outside the city. These Nicias, with 120 light-armed Methonians, 60 picked men from the Athenian heavy infantry, and all the archers, tried to reach by a path running up the hill, but received a wound, and found himself unable to force the position, while Nicostratus, with all the rest of the army, advancing upon the hill, which was naturally difficult, by a different approach further off, was thrown into utter disorder, and the whole Athenian army narrowly escaped being defeated. For that day, as the Mendaeans and their allies showed no signs of yielding, the Athenians retreated and encamped, and the Mendaeans at nightfall returned into the town. The next day the Athenians sailed round to the Scione side, and took the suburb, and all day plundered the country, without anyone coming out against them, partly because of intestine disturbances in the town, and the following night the 300 Scionians returned home. On the morrow Nicias advanced with half the army to the frontier of Scione, and laid waste the country, while Nicostratus with the remainder sat down before the town near the upper gate on the road to Potidæa. The arms of the Mendaeans and of their Peloponnesian auxiliaries within that wall happened to be piled in that quarter, where Polydamidas accordingly began to draw them up for battle, encouraging the Mendaeans to make a sortie. At this moment one of the popular party answered him factiously that they would not go out and did not want a war, and for thus answering was dragged by the arm and knocked about by Polydamidas. Hereupon the infuriated commons at once seized their arms and rushed at the Peloponnesians and at their allies of the opposite faction. The troops thus assaulted were at once routed, partly from the suddenness of the conflict, and partly through fear of the gates being opened to the Athenians, with whom they imagined that the attack had been concerted. As many as were not killed on the spot took refuge in the citadel, which they had held from the first, and the whole Athenian army, Nicias having by this time returned and being close to the city, now burst into Mende, which had opened its gates without any convention, and sacked it just as if they had taken it by storm, the generals even finding some difficulty in restraining them from also massacring the inhabitants. After this the Athenians told the Mendaeans that they might retain their civil rights, and themselves judge their supposed authors of the revolt, and cut off the party in the citadel by a wall built down to the sea on either side, appointing troops to maintain the blockade. Having thus secured Mende, they proceeded against Scione. The Scionaeans and Peloponnesians marched out against them, occupying a strong hill in front of the town, which had to be captured by the enemy before they could invest the place. The Athenians stormed the hill, defeated and dislodged its occupants, and having encamped and set up a trophy, prepared for the work of circumvallation. Not long after they had begun their operations, the auxiliaries besieged in the citadel of Mende forced the guard by the seaside, and arrived by night at Scione, into which most of them succeeded in entering, passing through the besieging army. While the investment of Scione was in progress, Perdiccas sent a herald to the Athenian generals, and made peace with the Athenians, through spite against Brasidas for the retreat from Lyncus, from which moment indeed he had begun to negotiate. The Lacedaemonian Ischagoras was just then upon the point of starting with an army overland to join Brasidas, and Perdiccas, being now required by Nicias to give some proof of the sincerity of his reconciliation to the Athenians, and being himself no longer disposed to let the Peloponnesians into his country, put in motion his friends in Thessaly, with whose chief men he always took care to have relations, and so effectually stopped the army in its preparations that they did not even try the Thessalians. Ischagoras himself, however, with Ammianius and Aristeus, succeeded in reaching Brasidas. They had been commissioned by the Lacedaemonians to inspect the state of affairs, and brought out from Sparta, in violation of all precedent, some of their young men to put in command of the towns, to guard against their being entrusted to the persons upon the spot. Brasidas accordingly placed Clearidas, son of Cleonymus, in Amphipolis, and Pasitalidas, son of Hegesander, in Torone. The same summer the Thebans dismantled the wall of the Thespians on the charge of Atticism, having always wished to do so, and now finding it an easy matter, as the flower of the Thespian youth had perished in the battle with the Athenians. The same summer also the temple of Hera at Argos was burnt down, through Chrysis, the priestess, placing a lighted torch near the garlands and then falling asleep, so that they all caught fire and were in a blaze before she observed it. Chrysis that very night fled to Phlius for fear of the Argives, who agreeably to the law in such a case appointed another priestess named Phineus. Chrysis at the time of her flight had been priestess for 8 years of the present war and half the 9th. At the close of the summer the investment of Scione was completed, and the Athenians, leaving a detachment to maintain the blockade, returned with the rest of their army. During the winter following, the Athenians and Lacedaemonians were kept quiet by the Armistice, but the Mantineans and Tegeans and their respective allies fought a battle at Laodicum in the Orestid. The victory remained doubtful, as each side routed one of the wings opposed to them, and both set up trophies and sent spoils to Delphi. After heavy loss on both sides, the battle was undecided, and night interrupted the action. Yet the Tegeans passed the night on the field and set up a trophy at once, while the Mantineans withdrew to Bucolion and set up theirs afterwards. At the close of the same winter, in fact almost in spring, Brasidas made an attempt upon Potidea. He arrived by night and succeeded in planting a ladder against the wall without being discovered, the ladder being planted just in the interval between the passing round of the bell and the return of the man who brought it back. Upon the garrison, however, taking the alarm immediately afterwards, before his men came up, he quickly led off his troops without waiting until it was day. So ended the winter, and the 9th year of this war, of which Thucydides is the historian. End of Book 4, Chapter 14.